Order! Order! Before we start today's business, I want to welcome members back, albeit in sombre circumstances. On behalf of the whole House, I want to record our shock and sadness at the tragic incident in Keyham last Thursday. I know all members want to join me in sending our condolences and sympathies to all those who've been affected in this terrible incident. I know that the House will also want to remember on this day, when we're here to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, that all the service personnel of this country who have lost their lives have been injured during this conflict. And I know there is no constituency that hasn't been touched, none more so than the two tragic serving personnel from Chorley who lost their lives. We all have reason to be here. I wish to remind the House that the provisions which allow for the hybrid participation in the Chamber are no longer in place. All contributions to proceedings will once again be made from within this Chamber. I remind members that if they participate in the debate, they should be present throughout most, if not all, of that debate, and certainly at least the opening speeches and two speeches following their contribution, and be here for the wind-up speeches. If the House divides today, members should enter both lobbies from the members' lobby end of the Chamber. Doorkeepers will be on hand to assist members participating in the division. I will instruct the doors to be locked 10 minutes after the start of the division. I'd also like to say thank you to all the staff of the House that's made today possible for giving up their time, breaking their holidays to ensure that this important debate goes ahead. We now come to motion number 1 relating to the sittings of the House. A minister to move.
To move.
To move. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 2 on business of the House. I wish to inform the House that I've selected a manuscript amendment to this motion. The amendment is in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden and the Honourable Member for Wellingborough, and is as follows. At line 3, leave out 2:30 and insert 5 p.m. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to move the motion and to inform the House Her Majesty's Government is willing to accept the manuscript amendment in the name of my honourable and right honourable friends.
We're completely in line with Thursday sittings. I thank the Leader of the House for that. I think that's important. So the original question at the House today, the question is that the amendment has been accepted. I think we can all agree on that. Do you need to speak? We're all happy. That's great. I want to get on with the debate. So there we are. Right, we've accepted that. We now come to motion number 3 in the name of the Prime Minister. I will call the Prime Minister to move the motion. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move, and may I begin by thanking you and all the parliamentary staff for enabling us to meet this morning. Before I turn to today's debate, I'm sure the House will want to join you, Mr. Speaker, and me in sending our condolences to the family and friends of those killed in the appalling shooting in Plymouth last week. Investigations are, of course, continuing, but we will learn every possible lesson from this tragedy. Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House share my concern about the situation in Afghanistan, the issues it raises for our own security, and the fears of many remaining in that country, especially women and children. The sacrifice in Afghanistan is seared into our national consciousness, with 150,000 people serving there from across the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, including a number of members on all sides of the House whose voices will be particularly important today. And so it's absolutely right that we should come together for this debate. And Mr. Speaker, yes, I will certainly give way to my right honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. As someone who opposed this nation-building intervention, it now brings its responsibilities. In addition to getting our nationals out safely and in offering a generous welcome to the many refugees, will the Prime Minister assure me that all necessary resources are given to those Afghans and others who have helped the British Council in its work, including the promotion of women's rights, because many are in fear of their lives of retribution from the Taliban, the Arab scheme is slow moving at the moment. Will he commit the necessary resource? Because the window of opportunity is narrow and no one must be left behind.
Got the point. Can I just remind people, if you are going to intervene, you've got to be short. If you intervene more than twice, you'll understand why you've gone down the list if there was one. Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I can assure him that I will, and as I will be saying in just a few moments, we will be supporting, doing everything we can to support those who have helped the UK mission in Afghanistan and investing everything that we can to support the wider area around Afghanistan and to do everything we can to avert a humanitarian crisis. Mr. Speaker, it's almost 20 years since the United States suffered the most catastrophic attack on its people since the Second World War, in which 67 British citizens also lost their lives at the hands of murderous terrorist groups incubated in Afghanistan. In response, NATO invoked Article 5 of its treaty for the first and only time in its history. And the United Kingdom, amongst others, joined America in going into Afghanistan on a mission to extirpate al-Qaeda in that country and to do whatever we could to stabilize Afghanistan in spite of all the difficulties and challenges we knew that we would face. And we succeeded in that core mission. And yes, I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, but would he agree that we are actually ceding back the country to the very insurgency that we went into defeat in the first place? And the reputation of the West to support democracies across the world has suffered. There are so many lessons to be learned from what happened over the last 20 years. Will he now agree to an independent formal inquiry into the conduct in Afghanistan?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in the House just a few weeks ago, there was an extensive defence review about the Afghan mission after the combat mission ended in 2014, and I believe that most of the key questions have already been extensively gone into. And it's important, Mr. Speaker, that we in this House should today be able to scrutinise events as they unfold. As I was saying, Mr. Speaker, we succeeded in that core mission, and the training camps in the mountain ranges of Afghanistan were destroyed. Al-Qaeda plots against this country were foiled because our serving men and women were there. And no successful terrorist attacks against the West have been mounted from Afghan soil for 2 decades. Happily give way to my right honourable friend.
Prime Minister, can I just take him back to his remarks in the House of July the 8th when he referred to the assessment that he'd made? There's clearly been a catastrophic failure of our intelligence or our assessment of the intelligence because of the speed that this has caught us unawares. Can the Prime Minister set out for the House how we may assure ourselves that in future years we can make sure there are no future terrorist attacks put together in Afghanistan that take place here in the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, I think it'd be fair to say that the events in Afghanistan have unfolded and the collapse has been faster than I think even the Taliban themselves predicted. What is not true is to say that the UK government was unprepared or did not foresee this, because it was certainly part of our planning of pitting the very difficult logistical operation for the withdrawal of UK nationals has been under preparation for many months, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell the House that the decision to commission the emergency handling centre at the airport, the commissioning of that centre took place 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker. So if I can just make a little bit more progress, Mr. Speaker. If I just a little bit, I will certainly give way in a moment. Alongside this core mission, we worked for a better future for the people of Afghanistan. And the heroism and tireless work of our armed forces contributed to national elections, as well as the promotion and protection of human rights and equalities in a way that many in Afghanistan had not previously known. Whereas 20 years ago, almost no girls went to school and women were banned from positions of governance, now 3.6 million girls have been in school this year alone, and women hold over a quarter of the seats in the Afghan Parliament. But, Mr. Speaker, we must be honest and accept that huge difficulties were encountered at each turn, and some of this progress is fragile. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. I pay tribute to our ambassador and the diplomatic team in Kabul and our armed forces on the ground who have been evacuating people in extraordinary circumstances. But one of the consequences of the rapidity of the collapse of Kabul is that many people have been left trapped, unable to access the airport, unable to evacuate, including many of those who should be coming to this country, who served us bravely in that country, and many women who are particularly at risk. Many of us across this House will have experienced chaos in the last 24, 48 hours in communicating information through to the ground to get some of those people out of the country. So can the Prime Minister give us some assurances about how we can get that information through so that we can get those brave people out of there, including many at risk of their lives right now in Kabul?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises exactly the right question. I spoke this morning to Ambassador Solori Bristow as well as to Brigadier Dan Blanchford, who's handling the evacuation. And it'd be fair to say the situation has stabilised since the weekend, but it remains precarious. And the UK officials on the ground are doing everything that they can to expedite the movement of people, those that need to come out, whether from the Arab scheme or the eligible persons, to get from Kabul to the airport. And at the moment, it would be fair to say that the Taliban are allowing that evacuation to go ahead. But the most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we get this done in as expeditious a fashion as we can, and that's what we are doing. And I may say that I'm grateful not just to the UK forces who are now out there helping to stabilize the airport, but also to the US forces as well. If I could just make some progress, Mr. Speaker. The combat phase of our mission ended in 2014, when we brought the vast majority of our troops home and handed over responsibility for security to the Afghans themselves, and we continued to support their efforts. Even at that stage, we should remember that conflict was continuous and that in spite of the bravery and sacrifice of the Afghan army, and we should never forget that 69,000 of those Afghan army troops have given their lives in this conflict. Significant parts of the country remain contested or under Taliban control. And so when after 2 decades, the Americans prepared to take their long predicted and well-trailed step of a final extraction of their forces, we looked at many options, Mr. Speaker, including the potential for staying longer ourselves, finding new partners, or even increasing our presence. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. Will you share with the House what assessment UK intelligence services made of the relative fighting capacity currently of the Afghan army and the Taliban? And will you tell us what representations the UK government made to our US allies with regards to their timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think that when he asks for a commentary on the respective military potential power of the Taliban and the Afghan forces, it's pretty clear from what has happened that the collapse of the Afghan forces has been much faster than expected. And as for our NATO allies and allies around the world, when it came for us to look at the options that this country might have in view of the American decision to withdraw, Mr. Speaker, we came up against this hard reality that since 2009, America has deployed 98% of all weapons released from NATO aircraft in Afghanistan. And at the peak of the operation, when there were 132,000 troops on the ground, 90,000 of them, Mr. Speaker, were American. The West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support and defense of America, without American logistics, without US air power, and without American might. And I do not believe, I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I note the point that he's making about the importance of American support for our efforts in Afghanistan and those of our allies. But will he please set out when he first spoke personally to Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, to discuss with him the possibility of putting together an alliance of other forces in order to replace the American support in Afghanistan?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I spoke to Secretary General Stoltenberg only the other day about NATO's continuing role in Afghanistan. But I really think that it is an illusion to believe that there is appetite amongst any of our partners for a continued military presence or for a military solution imposed by NATO in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. That idea ended with the combat mission in 2014, and I do not believe that today, I do not believe that deploying tens of thousands of British troops to fight the Taliban is an option that, no matter how sincerely people may advocate it, and I appreciate their sincerity, but I do not believe that that is an option that would commend itself either to the British people or, Mr. Speaker, to this House. Mr. Speaker, we must deal with the position as it now is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And I will give way to the right honourable lady.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. He seemed to be making an argument earlier that he had anticipated something similar to what went on by having the rapid response force ready and waiting. Why then was he and the Foreign Secretary both on their holidays when this catastrophe happened?
Mr. Speaker, the government has been working around the clock to deal with the unfolding situation, and we must deal with the world as it is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And the UK will work with our international partners on a shared plan to support the people of Afghanistan and to contribute to regional stability. There will be 5 parts, Mr. Speaker, to this approach. First, our immediate focus, in just a minute, our immediate focus must be on helping those to whom we have direct obligations by evacuating UK nationals together with those Afghans who have assisted our efforts over the past 20 years. And I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the bravery and commitment of our Ambassador, Sir Laurie Bristow. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for giving way on that particular point. He will be aware that there are 228 missionaries in Afghanistan currently under sentence of death. Those missionaries need to be taken out of Afghanistan. Of course, there are tens of thousands of others who are under sentence of death and fear for their life. Will the Prime Minister assure the House that every effort will be made to bring back to safe haven people whose lives are under threat as a result of the catastrophe and foreign policy episode that has gone on in that country?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for raising the very needy case that he does, and I'm sure that colleagues across the House, literally every member, would I imagine, has received messages from people who know someone who needs to get out of Afghanistan, and I can tell the right honourable gentleman that we are doing everything we can to help out of that country those people to whom we owe, Mr. Speaker, a debt of obligation. And on that point, I want to repeat my thanks, not just to Laurie Bristow, but also to the Commander on the ground, Brigadier Dan Blanchford, and the entire British team in Kabul. I can tell the House that we have so far, I'm going to make some progress, Mr. Speaker. We have so far secured the safe return of 306 UK nationals and 2,052 Afghan nationals as part of our resettlement programme, with a further 2,000 Afghan applications completed and many more being processed. UK officials are working round the clock to keep the exit door open in the most difficult circumstances and actively seeking those we believe are eligible but as yet unregistered. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. Can you explain then how many people think are still eligible for relocation and have still to sign up? He says they're doing everything they can
to get these people out. So what does everything they can mean? How are they identifying these people, where they are, especially if they're already in hiding in fear of their lives?
That's why, Mr. Speaker, it's been so important that we maintain a presence at Kabul airport, and that's why we've been getting the message out that we want people to come through. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, earlier on, it is important for everybody to understand that at the moment, in the days that we have ahead of us, which may be short, but at the moment, this is an environment in which the Taliban are permitting this evacuation to take place. Mr. Speaker, these are interpreters, they are locally engaged staff, and others who have risked their lives supporting our military efforts and seeking to secure new freedoms for their country. We are proud to bring these brave Afghans to our shores, and we continue to appeal for more to come forward. And I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. The Home Secretary announced this morning that that the UK will be taking 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan, but that only 5,000 will be able to come this year. What are the 15,000 meant to do? Hang around and wait until they've been executed?
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Speaker, that's the 5,000 on whom we're spending 200 million to bring a further 5,000 on top of the, I think it will be a 10,000 altogether that we bring in under the ARAP and other programs. We will be increasing that number over the coming years to, as I said, to 20,000. But the bulk of the effort of this country will be directed and should be directed, Mr. Speaker, to supporting people in Afghanistan and in the region, Mr. Speaker, in order to prevent a worse humanitarian crisis. And I believe, and may I tell the House that in that conviction, I am supported very strongly both by President Macron of France and by Chancellor Merkel of Germany. We are also, Mr. Speaker, doing everything possible to accelerate the visas for the
member for Hyndburn can't be like a drone in the chamber, completely above everybody all the way through. Stand up and down, please, not just hover. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I was telling the House that we are making sure that we bring back the 35 brilliant evening scholars so that they can come and study in our great universities. We're deploying an additional 800 British troops to support this evacuation operation. And I can assure the House that we will continue this operation for as long as conditions at the airport allow. And I would give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as of last week, it was still Home Office policy that we would send people back to Kabul because we thought Kabul was safe. Can the Prime Minister now also confirm it's not just about people coming out of Afghanistan, it's about keeping people safe here, and we will not send people back to this nightmare?
She's entirely right. We will not be sending people back to Afghanistan, and nor, by the way, Mr. Speaker, will be allowing people to come from Afghanistan to this country in an indiscriminate way. We want to be generous, but we must make sure that we look after our own security. And over the coming weeks, we will redouble our efforts, working with others to protect the UK homeland and all our citizens and interests from any threat that may emanate from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, from terrorism to the narcotics trade. And I give way to my honourable friend, Taliban.
Does he agree with me that we have to do everything we can to support those who have supported us, like Royal Marine Pen Farthing and his Nowzad charity of veterinary staff and their immediate family who now need safe passage back to the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I think, like many of us, I have been extensively lobbied on behalf of the excellent work done by Mr. Pen Farthing. I'm well aware of his cause, all the wonderful things that he has done, and for animals in Afghanistan. I can tell my honourable friend that we will do everything we can to help Mr. Pen Farthing and others who face particular difficulty, like himself. And but as I say, without in any way jeopardizing our own national security. These are concerns shared across the international community, from the region itself to all the NATO alliance, and indeed all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And I will chair a virtual meeting of the G7 in the coming days. Third, Mr. Speaker, we also have an enduring commitment to all the Afghan people. And now, more than ever, we must reaffirm that commitment. Our efforts must be focused on supporting the Afghan people in the region itself, particularly those fleeing conflict or the threat of violence. We therefore call on the United Nations to lead a new humanitarian effort in this region. And I give way to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and I welcome his commitment to support in the region and also the government's commitment to a resettlement programme. But could he confirm the Home Secretary announced in 2019 that the UK would continue a resettlement scheme of 5,000 refugees a year after the Syrian scheme closed? Could he confirm that the announcement today of an Afghan resettlement scheme is in addition to that existing 5,000 resettlement commitment, as opposed to simply being a refocusing or a displacement of that existing 5,000 a year resettlement programme?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite, because I think she's asked a question that formed itself in many people's minds about the 5,000s. And yes, indeed, the 5,000 that extra in the resettlement scheme are additional to those already announced. And we will support those people in coming to this country. We will also support the wider international community in delivering on humanitarian projects in the region by doubling, Mr. Speaker, the amount of humanitarian and development assistance that we had previously committed to Afghanistan this year, with new funding, wait for it, Mr. Speaker, taking this up to £286 million with immediate effect. And we call on others, £286 million with immediate effect, and we call on others to work together on a shared humanitarian effort, focusing on helping the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. And I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, and he's being very generous with his time. Over the past 20 years, there have been some 50 NATO and partner nations that have been involved in Afghanistan. I welcome the measures that have been proposed by the UK and other countries such as the US, Canada, France, Germany, and so on. However, there are many countries still who have been involved in Afghanistan in recent years who have still yet to come to the plate and to recognise their responsibility in helping these people at this desperate time. Would the Prime Minister inform the House what is being done to encourage these other countries to take up their responsibility and help these people in Afghanistan?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the UK has chaired the Security Council of the UN and asked to put a motion together with our French friends to get the world to focus on the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan. We'll be doing the same thing in NATO, in the G7, and the other bodies in which we have a leadership role. And we want all these countries to step up, as he rightly says, Mr. Speaker, and focus on the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, I've given away, I think you'll agree, quite a lot already this morning, and I know that thanks to the generosity of yourself, Mr. Speaker, and the House, there is now ample time for debate until later on this afternoon, where I think many members will be able to get their points across. I therefore intend, Mr. Speaker, by your leave, to make some progress. Fourth, while we must focus on the region itself, we will also create safe and legal routes for those Afghans most in need to come and settle here in the UK. So in addition to those Afghans with whom we've worked directly, I can announce today that we're committing to relocating another 5,000 Afghans this year with a new and bespoke resettlement scheme focusing on the most vulnerable, particularly women and children. And we will keep this under review for future years with the potential of accommodating up to 20,000 over the long term. And so taken together, Mr. Speaker, I've been very generous with my interventions. I think you will agree already, and I've made my position clear. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, we are committing almost £500 million of humanitarian funding to support the Afghan people. Fifth, Mr. Speaker, we must also face the reality of a change of regime in Afghanistan. And as President of the G7, the UK will work to unite the international community behind a clear plan for dealing with this regime in a unified and concerted way. Over the last 3 days, I've spoken with the NATO and UN Secretary General, with President Biden, with Chancellor Merkel, with President Macron, and Prime Minister Khan. We are clear and we have agreed that it would be a mistake for any country to recognize any new regime in Kabul prematurely or bilaterally. Instead, those countries that care about Afghanistan's future should work towards common conditions about the conduct of the new regime before deciding together whether to recognize it and on what terms. We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words. On its attitude to terrorism, to crime and narcotics, as well as humanitarian access and the rights of girls to receive an education. Defending human rights will remain of the highest priority, and we will use every available political and diplomatic means to ensure that those human rights remain at the top of the international agenda. Mr. Speaker, our United Kingdom has a roll call of honour that bears the names of 457 servicemen and women who gave their lives in some of the world's harshest terrain, and many others who bear injuries to this day, fighting in what had become the epicenter of global terrorism. And even amid the heart-wrenching scenes we see today, I believe they should be proud of their achievements. And we should be deeply proud of them, because they conferred benefits that are lasting and ineradicable on millions of people in one of the poorest countries on earth. And they provided vital protection for 2 decades to this country and the rest of the world. They gave their all for our safety, and we owe it to them to give our all to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Because no matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written. And at this bleak turning point, we must help the people of Afghanistan to choose the best of all their possible futures. And in the UN, the G7, in NATO, with friends and partners around the world, that is the critical task on which this government is now urgently engaged and will be engaged in the days to come.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Afghanistan. Can I suggest the backbenchers will be starting with 7 minutes? And now I call on the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you and the staff for recalling Parliament for today's debate. Before I get to the urgent issue at hand, let me join you, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling shootings in Plymouth last week. We all send our condolences to the bereaved families. We must resolve to ensure that firearms do not get into the hands of dangerous people, and finally, to get to grips with the way that hate thrives on the internet. Turning to Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, it's been a disastrous week, an unfolding tragedy. 20 years ago, the Taliban were largely in control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda were using the country as a training ground and a base for terror, including plotting the horrific 9/11 attack. There were widespread human rights abuses. Girls were denied an education. Women couldn't work. Being gay was punishable by death.
all imposed without democracy. Since then, a fragile democracy emerged. Mr. Speaker, it was by no means perfect, but no international terrorist attacks have been mounted from Afghanistan in that period. Women have gained liberty and one office. Schools and clinics have been built, and Afghans have allowed themselves to dream of a better future. Mr. Speaker, those achievements were born of sacrifice. Sacrifice by the Afghan people who bravely fought alongside their NATO allies, and British sacrifice. Over 150,000 UK personnel have served in Afghanistan, including members across this House, including the honourable and gallant members for Tunbridge and Moling, for Barnsley Central, Plymouth Moorview, Norwich South, Aldershot, the Isle of Wight, Filton and Bradley Stoke, and Wells. They and the tens of thousands of others deployed in Afghanistan served in difficult and challenging circumstances. And the Labour Party, and I'm sure everybody across this House, thanks each and every one of them, of the 150,000. Many returned with life-changing injuries. And tragically, 457 didn't return at all. I'll just make progress and then I will.
Later today, I'll be attending the service at RAF Lynham outside Rolwyn Bassett to commemorate the 10th anniversary of 4 today of the last repatriation through Bassett. Will the right honourable gentleman agree with me that the message to those people that I will see today must be not that these young lives were wasted, but that they played an absolutely essential role in deterring and destroying terrorism and carrying out so many other good works in Afghanistan?
I wholeheartedly agree with that and will address it in just one moment. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for many of those who returned from Afghanistan and other places around the world, mental health has been an all too familiar issue raised by veterans time and again. And the events of the last few days and weeks will have exacerbated the situation, reopening old wounds, and everybody across this House will have had examples of that. So we must improve mental health services for our veterans. Mr. Speaker, in addressing the very point that's just been made, I want to address directly all those who served in Afghanistan and their families, especially the families of those who were lost. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You brought stability, reduced the terrorist threat, and enabled progress. We are all proud of what you did. Your sacrifice deserves better than this, and so do the Afghan people. Mr. Speaker, there's been a major miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and staggering complacency from our government about the Taliban threat. The result is that the Taliban are now back in control of Afghanistan. The gains made through 20 years of sacrifice hang precariously. Women and girls fear for their liberty. Afghan civilians are holding onto the undercarriage of NATO aircraft, literally clinging to departing hope. And we face new threats to our security and an appalling humanitarian crisis. I will.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for all the reasons he mentioned. Doesn't he agree that President Biden is actually wrong when he talks about American sacrifices in a civil war? The Taliban is not at war with a regime. The Taliban is at war with the civilized values of justice, equality, and tolerance that all of us hold dear, and against which it respects no international boundaries.
I would agree with that intervention and thank the honourable member for it. Mr. Speaker, I'll just make some progress and then I will, of course. Mr. Speaker, the desperate situation requires leadership and for the Prime Minister to snap out of his complacency. The most urgent task is the protection of our diplomatic staff still working heroically in Kabul and the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans who've risked their lives. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, the Labour Party fully supports the deployment of troops to this end. We want it to succeed just as quickly and safely as possible. The Defence Secretary has said that some people who've worked with us will not get back. Unconscionable. The government, in one moment I will, the government must outline a plan to work with our allies to do everything that's possible to ensure that does not happen. Guarantee that our troops have the resources they need to carry out their mission effectively and as safely as possible, and work to provide stable security at the airport in Kabul so that flights can depart and visas can be processed. We all know how difficult that is. We all know how hard everybody is working on the ground, and we fully support it. And I raise an issue not by way of criticism, but just to get some reassurance, because there are reports this morning from NGOs that an evacuation plane left almost empty this morning because evacuees couldn't get to the airport to get to that plane. As I say, we are not challenging the work on the ground. We know how difficult it is, but at some appropriate moment, I would like to see that addressed. If true, I will, yes.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms, really, of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who have lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us. Does he not think that that is shameful?
Mr. Speaker, the US is, of course, an important ally, but to overlook the fighting of the Afghan troops and forces in recent years, they have been at the forefront of that fighting, I think is wrong for any of us to overlook all the situation that they now find themselves in. Mr. Speaker, the urgent task is, of course, the evacuation. Equally urgent is the immediate refugee crisis. I'll just make some progress and then I will. Many Afghans have bravely sought to rebuild their country. They did so on a promise of democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and liberty for the oppressed, including women and girls. They are our friends, and that was our promise. They are now fearing for their lives. We do not turn our backs on friends at their time of need. We owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There should be a resettlement scheme for people to rebuild their lives here. Safe and legal routes. It must be a resettlement scheme that meets the scale of the enormous challenge. But what the government has announced this morning does not do that. It is vague. It will support just 5,000 in the first year, a number without rationale. Was that based on a risk assessment of those most at need, or was it plucked out of the air? Others, the offer to others in one moment, the offer to others is in the long term, But for those desperately needing our help now, there is no long term, Mr. Speaker. Just day-to-day survival. Yet again, this government, I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, as well as the need for a much more bold and ambitious resettlement programme. Would he agree with me that this disaster must mark a turning point for our failed asylum system, in particular getting rid of the so-called hostile environment and the Nationality and Borders Bill, under which a woman fleeing the Taliban with her children on a boat across the Channel would be criminalised? Does he agree that that bill must now be revised?
Thank you for that intervention. I'm going to come on to the specifics of the system, because yet again, this government seems ill-prepared and unwilling, just as it has been too slow to provide sanctuary to Afghans who've served alongside Britain. Too many reports of eligible Afghans facing bureaucratic hurdles and too many unfairly excluded. Mr. Speaker, knowing the date of withdrawal was coming for months, The Home Office is not close to completing the process they've already got up and running. It was designed to help 7,000 people, yet Home Office figures this week showed only 2,000 have been helped so far. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And the point that I wanted to make indeed to the Prime Minister was the situation facing Afghan Sikhs. Now, I know from my own constituency casework that there are Afghan Sikhs in the system at the moment waiting for clearance from the Home Office. So one of the things I would like to call on the government to do is to process those as quickly as possible and not leave all those people in the system waiting any longer than they have to at the moment. They are terrified with the idea of being sent back home. And despite the reassurance given to my honourable friend, I do not see any movement from the Home Office to give these people the legal status that they need.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and there have been other examples across the House of individuals and groups who are very obviously at risk in Afghanistan and need to come out just as quickly as possible. And that's, Mr. Speaker, where the question arises to what's behind the 5,000 number and why the others are having to wait so long. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the refugee crisis requires an international response, but we must lead it and lead with a resettlement programme that meets the scale of the challenge. The scheme must be generous and welcoming. If it's not, we know the consequences. We know the consequences now. Violent reprisals in Afghanistan, people tragically fleeing into the arms of human traffickers. We know this is what will happen. More people risking and losing their lives on unsafe journeys, including across the English Channel. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. I will.
For him giving way. He speaks of people fleeing, but what we have yet to assess is whether anyone outside of Kabul is able to get to somewhere of safety. Does he agree that now a safe corridor needs to be opened to an international border so that those who are not near Kabul can also get to safety via third countries?
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention. And there is huge concern, as all members will know, about our line of sight beyond Kabul just at the moment. And again, that calls into question where the 5,000 number comes from, because we're not even in a position to assess at the moment the position outside of Kabul. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. Mr. Speaker, I will.
The government of this kingdom to be overthrown by a wicked and brutal regime, I venture that he would want a leading role in the resistance. He wouldn't be queuing at the airport, would he?
When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I had some of my prosecutors in Afghanistan at huge risk working on counter-terrorism with other brave souls there. So I won't take that from him or anybody else. Mr. Speaker, once these immediate challenges are addressed, we face an uncertain and difficult future. The Taliban are back in control, and we cannot be naive about the consequences. We've lost our primary source of leverage in political discussions, and everything we've achieved in the last 20 years is now under threat. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right to say that we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a training ground for violent hate and terrorism. But that will be more difficult now that Afghanistan has descended into chaos. But if preventing al-Qaeda camps is now the limit of our ambition, we are betraying 20 years of sacrifice by our armed forces, and we're betraying the Afghan people who cannot be left to the cruelty of the Taliban. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He speaks about the lack of ambition and the lack of urgency, which of course summarises everything about this government's approach to this crisis and many others. Isn't it telling about the whole approach of this government that when we had an Afghan government that we wanted to support, they should cut the amount of overseas aid we sent, and now the Taliban are in charge, they're talking about increasing the amount of overseas aid?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm going to come to the question of aid in just a minute, because it's a very important point in this context, looking at what has happened in recent weeks and months. I'm going to make some progress and then I will make way. So we have to use every tool that remains at our disposal to protect human rights in Afghanistan. The government is right not to recognise the Taliban as the official government. And the Prime Minister's made that clear. But this must be part of a wider strategy developed with our UN security partners, our NATO allies, to apply pressure to the Taliban, not only to stamp out a resurgence of terror groups, but to retain the liberties and human rights of Afghans. We must work with Afghans' neighbours to ensure there is consistent pressure, and there must be a UN-backed plan to ensure our aid budget is used to support humanitarian causes in Afghanistan, not fund the Taliban. Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult task with no guarantee of success. So it should concern us all that the Prime Minister's judgment on Afghanistan has been appalling. Mr. Speaker, nobody believes that Britain and our allies could have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, or that Britain could have fought alone. NATO leaders were put in a difficult position after President Trump agreed with the Taliban that all US forces would withdraw by May 2021. But, Mr. Speaker, that agreement was made in February 2020, 18 months ago. We've had 18 months to prepare and plan for the consequences of what followed, to plan and to prepare for the resettlement of refugees and those that have supported us, for supporting the Afghan government in managing withdrawal, for securing international and regional pressure on the Taliban and support for the Afghan government. The very problems we're confronting today in this debate were all known problems for the last 18 months, and there's been a failure of preparation. Mr. Speaker, the lack of planning is unforgivable, and the Prime Minister bears a heavy responsibility. Mr. Speaker, he mutters today. He was in a position to lead, but he didn't. Britain holds a seat at the United Nations Security Council. We're a key player within NATO. We're chair of the G7. Every one of these platforms could and should have been used to prepare for the withdrawal of forces, to rally international support behind a plan to stabilise Afghanistan through the process and keep us safe. I will give way in just a minute. But what did Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister use those platforms in those 18 months to prepare? No, he didn't. What did he do? What did he do instead? We debated this. He cut the development budget. He cut the development budget that was key to the strength and resilience of democracy in Afghanistan. He's making a great deal today of the money he's putting in. £292 million was spent in Afghanistan in 2019. In 2021, 155 million. Short-sighted, small-minded, and a threat to security. I will in a moment. I'm going to make this list. He failed to visit Afghanistan as Prime Minister, meaning that his last trip as Foreign Secretary in 2018 was not to learn or to push British interests, but to avoid a vote on Heathrow. Hundreds of thousands of British people have flown to Afghanistan to serve. The Prime Minister flew to avoid public service. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. In March this year, the Prime Minister published an integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. Huge review. He boasted that the review would, in his words, demonstrate to our allies in Europe and beyond that they can always count on the UK when it really matters. Well, the Afghan government was an ally, yet in the integrated review, there were just 2 passing references to Afghanistan. 2 passing references. Mr. Speaker, the review didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't mention NATO withdrawal or the consequences of the Doha Agreement. It did cut the size of the army, and we did criticise it at the time. The very force that we're now relying on, eye off the ball, astonishingly careless.
You were probably on holiday.
The question is, why was the Prime Minister so careless? Why did he fail to lead? Mr. Speaker, it comes down to complacency and poor judgment. There was a calculation. I will in a moment, I'm going to make this case. There was a calculation that withdrawal would lead to military stalemate in Afghanistan and that stalemate would accelerate political discussions. Seeing this in July, members on both sides of this House warned the government, read Hansard, that they may be underestimating the threat of the Taliban. On both sides of the House, that point was made. That was ignored. And the government's preparation for withdrawal were based on a miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and a staggering complacency about the Taliban threat. The Prime Minister is as guilty as anyone. This Sunday, he said this, and I quote, "We've known for a long time that this was the way things were going." That's what he said on Sunday. That's not what he told this House. That's not what he told this House. In July, the Prime Minister stood there and assured members that there is no military path to victory for the Taliban. And then he went on to say, Mr. Speaker, "I do not think that the Taliban are capable of victory by military means." The British government were wrong and complacent. The Prime Minister was wrong and complacent. And when he wasn't rewriting history, the Prime Minister was displaying the same appalling judgment and complacency last week. Mr. Speaker, the response of the British ambassador to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to personally process the paperwork for those that needed to flee. He is still there, and we thank him and his staff. The Prime Minister's response to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to go on holiday. No sense of the gravity of the situation, not leadership to drive international efforts on the evacuation. The Foreign Secretary shakes his head. Mr. Speaker, what would I do differently? I wouldn't stay on holiday whilst Kabul was falling. And there are numerous examples of those leaders on both sides of the House who've come back immediately in a time of crisis. The Foreign Secretary stayed on his... He's shouting now. He's shouting now. Silent.
Mr. Odd. The Prime Minister was heard, and I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I don't want people to shout, you may disagree, but you'll also may wish to catch my eye. Don't ruin that chance. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary shouts now, but he stayed on holiday while our mission in Afghanistan was disintegrating. Mr. Speaker, he didn't even speak to ambassadors in the region as Kabul fell to the Taliban. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. You cannot coordinate an international response from the beach. A dereliction of duty by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, a government totally unprepared for the scenario that it had 18 months to prepare for. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for people to lose trust in the Prime Minister at home, but when the trust in the word of our Prime Minister is questioned abroad, there are serious consequences for our safety and security at home. Mr. Speaker, in one moment, recent events in Afghanistan shame the West. Not just the scenes of chaos, but what it says about our abandonment of the Afghan people. For those brave people around the world living under regimes paying scant regard to human rights but resisting those regimes in pursuit of democracy, equality, and individual freedom. What does this say to them? What does this retreat from freedom signal to those prepared to stand up for it? What does this surrender to extremism mean for those prepared to face it down? And what does it mean for those nations who support an international rules-based system when we hand over power to those who recognise no rules at all? That is the challenge of our time. Mr. Speaker, the British and Afghan people will have to live with the consequences of the Prime Minister's failure. We have fought for 20 years to rid Afghanistan of terror, terror which threatens our security here in Britain and liberty in Afghanistan. The Taliban are back in control. The Prime Minister has no plan how to handle the situation, just as he had no plan to prevent it. What we've won through 20 years of sacrifice could all be lost. That is the cost, Mr. Speaker, of careless leadership. Thank you.
Theresa May.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the opportunity to visit Afghanistan twice, but I recognise that there are others across this House whose experience is more recent, more vivid, more practical, longer and broader than mine. But when I was there, I was struck by the commitment and dedication of our armed forces serving there and of other British personnel. All were doing what they could to give hope to the people of Afghanistan. People who, thanks to our presence, were able to enjoy freedoms they had been denied under the Taliban. 20 years on, 457 British military personnel have died in Afghanistan, and many more have suffered life-changing injuries. Yes, many girls have been educated because of British aid, but it is not just that the freedoms once enjoyed will now be taken away, but there are many, many Afghans, not just those who worked with British forces, who are now in fear of their lives. It is right that we should open up a refugee scheme, but we must make it absolutely certain that it is accessible to all those who need it. Now, of course, the NATO presence was always going to end at some point in time, but the withdrawal when it came was due to be orderly, planned, and on the basis of conditions. It has been none of these. What has been most shocking has been the chaos and the speed of the takeover by the Taliban. In July of this year, both President Biden and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, indicated that they did not think that the Taliban was ready or able to take over control of the country. Was our intelligence really so poor? Was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate? Or did we really believe this? Or did we just feel that we had to follow the United States and hope that on a wing and a prayer, it would be all right on the night? Because the reality is, if I may just make this point, the reality is that as long as a time limit was given and dates were given for withdrawal, all the Taliban had to do was to ensure there were sufficient problems for the Afghan government not to be able to have full control of the country, and then just sit and wait.
Would my right honourable friend agree that President Biden decided unilaterally to withdraw without agreeing and negotiating a plan with either the Afghan government or the NATO allies, and that the response of the UK government in the circumstances has been fast, purposeful and extremely well guided to protecting the interests of UK citizens?
Can I just say to my right honourable friend that what President Biden has done is upheld a decision that was made by President Trump. It was a unilateral decision of President Trump to do a deal with the Taliban that has led to this withdrawal. And of course, what we've seen from the scenes in Afghanistan is that it hasn't been all right on the night. As I say, there are many in Afghanistan who fear not just that their lives will be irrevocably changed for the worse, but who fear for their lives. Numbered among them will be women. Women who embrace freedom, embrace the right to education, to work and to participate in the political process. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was right to make the education of girls a key aim of his administration. But in Afghanistan, that will now be swept away. Those girls who have been educated will have no opportunity to use that education. The Taliban proclaim that women will be allowed to work and girls will be allowed to go to school, but this will be under Islamic law, or rather under their interpretation of Islamic law.
Am I right, Honourable
And we,
on that?
if I may just, and we have seen before what that means for the lives of women and girls. Are you with?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend giving way on that point. Some of the women who show most courage are the 250 women who serve as judges under the attempt that was made to impose a decent, honest legal system on Afghanistan. They are particularly feared as being targets. The Bar Council and the Law Society have asked the government to particularly take cognizance of the particular risks that they run. Will she support the court for them to be given particular priority in being brought to safety? Because they put their lives on their line for their fellow women and for their whole country.
Very important point. As has been said, there are many groups in Afghanistan who have actually put their lives on the line to support the Afghan government, to support democracy, to support justice in Afghanistan. And it is right that we should do everything that we can to support them in their time of need. But as we know, I may just make a further point about women and girls. As we know, under the Taliban regime, sadly, the life of women and girls will not be the same. They will not have the rights that we believe they should have, and they will not have the freedoms that they should have. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Okay. There are already reports from sources in Kabul that the Taliban is executing collaborators and homosexuals. Does she agree with me that complacency is absolutely misplaced? And what does she suggest should we do to protect those people who need to get out?
Can I say to the honourable lady that the government is doing much to protect people in trying to ensure that it is possible for people to be able to access ways of leaving Afghanistan. Now, I think a point was made earlier about the issue of not just expecting people to get to Kabul, and I hope that this is something that the government will be able to look into and be able to take up. Furthermore, apart from the impact on people's lives in terms of women and girls, we do see potential humanitarian crisis, at least in some parts of Afghanistan. Now, of course, we cut our international aid budget, but I'm pleased that the Foreign Secretary has told me that more funding is going to be made available to deal with this crisis. But it isn't just about the impact of the people on Afghanistan that must concern us. We must be deeply concerned about the possible impact here in the UK. The aim of our involvement in Afghanistan was to ensure that it could not be used as a haven for terrorists. Terrorists who could train, plot and encourage attacks here in the UK. Al-Qaeda has not gone away. Daesh may have lost their ground in Syria, but these terrorist groups remain and they have spawned others. We will not defeat them until we have defeated the ideology which feeds their extremism.
Thank you, my friend, for giving way. Is she concerned? I mean, one of the most concerning things that's happening is that several thousand Al-Qaeda operatives have been freed from Bagram prison, from Kabul prison, from Kandahar. Is she concerned that these people are going to go back to their old ways, or do we hope that they're somehow going to go into retirement? Because it seems to me that we are going to restart a new round of international terrorism.
Well, my honourable friend has actually anticipated a point I was exactly about to make, which is the Taliban, of course, have said that they will not allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorists again. Yesterday in the press conference, they said they would not allow anything to happen in Afghanistan which led to attacks elsewhere across the world. But their actions must be what we look at, not their words. And their action has, as my honourable friend has just pointed out, been to release thousands of high-value Taliban, Al-Qaeda and Daesh fighters. So their action is completely different from their words. And I think it is absolutely essential for us to recognise that the probability that Afghanistan will once again become a breeding ground for the terrorists who seek to destroy our way of life.
Thank you for giving way, because making exactly the point I hoped to hear from the Prime Minister and didn't. The reasons that we went into Afghanistan in 2002 remain valid today. If the actions that have been taken in recent weeks render a military solution to that problem impossible, then we have to have a non-military solution. What does she see that non-military solution as being?
To the right honourable gentleman, I'm going to make a reference later on to this issue. I think that he is absolutely right that the question of a military solution has not been there actually for some time, because our combat mission ended some years ago. But what we have been doing is trying to provide the support to enable a democratic government to actually take proper control of that country. I'd be happy to talk to the right honourable gentleman at some time about my views, but actually I think that the idea of trying to impose just a Western example of democracy, actually in a country which is geographically difficult and which relies a lot on regional government, is possibly was a route that we should have reconsidered when we were going down that route. But I will not go down that road any longer, despite his temptations. But there was another.
About the time for backbencher, I did suggest it was 7 minutes. We're now heading to 10. I didn't put a time limit on, but I'm going to have to do after this.
Speaker, I'm very grateful for your generosity to me. For the UK, there was another important element of our work in Afghanistan. That was stopping the drugs from coming into the United Kingdom. Sadly, that has not been as successful as we would have liked it to be, but we did support a drug crime-specific criminal justice system in Afghanistan. I assume that is now going to come to a complete end. So once again, this is another area where withdrawal is not just about Afghanistan, it has an impact on the streets of the UK. But what must also be of key concern to us is the message this sends around the world to those who would do the West harm. The message it sends about our capabilities and, most important, about our willingness to defend our values. What does it say about us as a country? What does it say about NATO if we are entirely dependent on a unilateral decision taken by the United States? Yes. We all understand the importance of American support. But despite the comments from my right honourable friend earlier, I do find it incomprehensible and worrying that the United Kingdom was not able to bring together not a military solution, but an alternative alliance of countries to continue to provide the support necessary to sustain a government in Afghanistan. Surely one outcome of this must be a reassessment of how NATO operates. NATO is the bedrock of European security, but Russia will not be blind to the implications of this withdrawal decision and the manner in which it has been taken. Neither will China and others have failed to notice the implications, because in recent years the West has appeared to be less willing to defend its values. This cannot continue, because if it does, it will embolden those who do not share those values and wish to impose their way of life on others. I'm afraid I think this has been a major setback for British foreign policy. We boast about global Britain, but where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? A successful foreign policy strategy will be judged by our deeds, not by our words. And I finally just say this: all of our military personnel, all who served in Afghanistan, should hold their heads high and be proud of what they achieved in that country over 20 years, of the change of life they brought to the people of Afghanistan and the safety they brought here to the UK. The politicians sent them there. The politicians decided to withdraw. The politicians must be responsible for the consequences.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I begin by thanking you for facilitating the recall of Parliament? It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, and I hope that the government will reflect very carefully on her words this morning, and particularly her remarks at the end of her contribution about the role of NATO in the light of the American decision to pull out of Afghanistan, because these are very real issues about the capabilities that we have within NATO, and if I may say so, not just about the capability of NATO, but how we make sure that the United Nations has all the tools at its disposal in order to do what we expect of it as well. And these are matters that we are going to have to return to in this House when we come back from recess. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the government for the briefings that we have had over the course of the last few days, and in particular I want to commend the Defence Secretary for making himself available in the way that he has conducted himself. And indeed, that is also true of ministers in the Home Office, and I'm thinking particularly of the member for Torbay, and in the Foreign Office, the member for Braintree, because it is important when we're talking about human lives being lost, that when it is possible, that in this House that we work together, but yes, of course, that we ask legitimate questions. Mr. Speaker, there can be little doubt that the chaos and the crisis being inflicted upon the Afghan people is the biggest foreign policy failure of modern times. The sheer scale of that political failure is only matched by the humanitarian emergency that it has now unleashed. As we gather here this morning, the future and the fate of Afghanistan has never been more uncertain. Afghanistan, a country that has been through so much, is once again facing a period of darkness. Over the course of the last week, we have watched these tragic images from afar. Mr. Speaker, the scenes of Afghans seeking to jump onto moving planes to escape will haunt us for the rest of our lives. We have watched from afar, but I think we all have a deep sense of sorrow of just how closely the UK has been involved in what has unfolded. Geographical distance doesn't for a second diminish the moral responsibility we need to feel for the West's role in this crisis. Washing our hands of this crisis won't make it go away, and it definitely won't wash away our responsibility to the Afghan people. We all know that acting now will be too little and too late, but better little and late than nothing at all. So today, Mr. Speaker, we have a choice. We can either offer meaningless words of sympathy, we can stand idly by, or we can start to do the right thing. We can take responsibility and act. The Home Secretary has today talked about evacuating more contacts of the UK-Afghanistan operation from the existing resettlement scheme. Let me be clear, there should be no ifs or buts. Everyone who has worked with UK forces and who by definition has a vulnerability has to be moved to a position of safety. No one can be left behind. That is our moral and ethical responsibility. All those who work with us are our responsibility. We cannot walk away from them. And I'm asking the government today to make that commitment. Mr. Speaker, their action needs to begin with a coordinated domestic and international effort to offer safe passage, shelter and support to refugees fleeing this crisis is obvious. And that action can't wait. If we are to act, we need to act with the same speed as the situation in Afghanistan has developed. I'm sad to say that the scheme announced last night by the UK government and today by the Prime Minister doesn't go near far enough or fast enough. It can only be right that the number of refugees we welcome here reflects the share of the responsibility the UK government has for this foreign policy disaster. And this scheme falls way short of that responsibility. The scheme needs to be far more ambitious, generous and swift to help the Afghan citizens that it has abandoned and left at serious risk of persecution and indeed of death. The scale of the efforts need to match the scale of this humanitarian emergency. Mr. Speaker,
Right, honourable friend, give way.
I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him. Considering that the government promised in 2016 to save 3,000 unaccompanied refugee children from Calais, is he not concerned that the numbers who have actually been saved stand at around 380? And if those promises can be broken, and amongst those children will be many from Afghanistan, is he concerned that the promises made today may be as
unrobust as those of the past.
I do agree with my right honourable friend that it's important that this House has the opportunity to reflect on this and consider what mechanisms that we do need to put in place in order to protect people in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is 3 million people have already been displaced. 80% of those fleeing their homes are women and children. These are people that are now crying out for our help.
I thank the gentleman for that. He'll be aware that yesterday the Nobel laureate Maria Nadia Murad said, "I know what happens when the world loses sight of women and girls in a crisis, when it looks away what is waged on women's bodies." She's sadly correct. Doesn't he agree that if we do not act now and go so much further than the government are proposing to protect women and girls, that this political disaster will become a catastrophic moral failure?
I agree with my honourable friend now, and I just reflected on the fact that 3 million people have already been displaced. We need to show that generosity of spirit that recognises the scale of the challenge that we face, and that women don't face the loss of their human rights, that women don't face persecution, and yes, that women don't face even worse, including up to death. Mr. Speaker, it is important to say that if we are to support the Afghan people, then this crisis needs to mark a point of fundamental change in this government's approach to refugees. In the past few months alone, this is a government which has introduced a hateful anti-refugee bill that would rip up, Mr. Speaker, international conventions. It would criminalise those coming from Afghanistan that are in need of our refuge. It is the UK government that has spent a sizable part of its summer making political play from turning away migrants and refugees in small boats, desperately making their way across the Channel. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Given that only Glasgow has been the only city and only authority in Scotland to be part of the resettlement scheme up until now, will the SNP actually stick to their rhetoric and start coming forward with other authority areas to be part of the resettlement scheme?
My goodness. I don't think the honourable gentleman has actually been listening to anything we've been saying over the course of the last few days, because, and I'll come on and I'll talk about this in more detail, because I've been asking about the Syrian resettlement scheme to work on the basis of the Syrian scheme that we had back in the last decade. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the Scottish Government stands ready to work with the UK Government. You know, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about people that are facing extreme risk, and that's what we get from the government benches, and they should really be careful that people in the United Kingdom are listening to this, and perhaps people in Afghanistan. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, a bit of dignity from the opposition benches wouldn't go remiss. But let me tell the government benches that I want to make sure that every local authority in Scotland has the opportunity to take refugees from Afghanistan. And that is precisely the position of the government in Scotland, but it has to come with the government in London and the devolved administrations working together. There has to be a summit of the four nations to discuss exactly how this will work.
I thank him for giving way. Just to correct the record, my local authority, Staffordshire Council, has got Syrian refugees. One old friend next to me is saying a guy on Butte, and we know Dundee has. So that is utter nonsense from the honourable member.
Correct the record. Correct the record. Well, my honourable friend is correct, and I also know in my own area in Highland that we have refugees from Syria as well, and indeed they were most welcomed by the community. And these are people, and let's just reflect on this, when we have the hostile environment that we're seeing once again from the party opposite, that these are people that have come here to receive sanctuary, who have gone on to make a contribution to our public life. They were welcome. Refugees are welcome, and Afghans are certainly welcome in every part of Scotland. I will, one last time.
I'm very grateful to him. Before he was rerouted by the honourable gentleman opposite, he's making a very powerful point about those who come across the channel in boats and the government's proposals for them. Does he recognise that according to refugee organisations like Safe Passage, 70% of the unaccompanied minors who are crossing in the channel are actually coming from Afghanistan, and to criminalise them is a criminal act in itself?
Yes, I agree with my right honourable friend, and the government has really got to reflect very carefully on this over the course of the summer and change their ways before we come back and debate these matters again. I'm going to make some progress, and I'll give way later on. I think we've just demonstrated that the hostile attitude and approach to refugees well and truly exists and extends to those from Afghanistan. Since the most recent conflict began in 2001, the Home Office has rejected asylum for 32,000 Afghans, including rejecting asylum for 875 girls. Mr. Speaker, the total number of Afghans currently in the system stands at around 3,117. So, if we are to have any confidence that this is a turning point, then this UK government needs to radically rethink how it will respond to the refugee crisis that is unfolding before our eyes.
I think the right honourable gentleman can give away. Nobody can fail. No one in this House can be failed to be moved by the scenes that we're seeing on our televisions coming from Afghanistan. And I'm delighted to hear that the Scottish Government is standing ready to do its part. Could the right honourable gentleman confirm how many refugees the Scottish Government are ready to resettle, please?
Well, I am going to come on and discuss this a little bit later on. Look, I have to say to the government benches, these are the most serious of issues, and I welcome the intervention from the honourable member. But I'm going to give you the example of what happened with Syria, because it's a real live example. That Scotland took 15% of the refugees that came. 20%. So we have done our bit, and we stand ready to do our bit. And I commit myself as leader of the SNP here, and I commit my government to work with the government here in London. But they have to extend that hand of friendship to us and to meet with us. One last time.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Let us hope that the issue of refugees does not become a political football in this place. All of us care desperately about giving these people safe haven. We welcome them in the Highlands, we welcome them everywhere. But would the right honourable gentleman agree with me that the proper finance to support our local authorities is forthcoming from the UK government and the Scottish government? Because without that, our councils will struggle.
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I agree with him. And of course, and I know he will associate himself with me, that we will extend 100,000 welcomes to those that wish to come to the Highlands of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, we have called for a four-nation summit to integrate these efforts across the United Kingdom, and I hope that the Prime Minister will respond positively to that, and he can take the opportunity just now, if he wishes to do so, that he will meet with the devolved administrations to discuss this, and perhaps he can indicate that he's happy to do that. So we have it on the record that the Prime Minister is happy for a four-nation summit, and I'm grateful for that.
Very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. There's been much focus today on making sure that we offer sanctuary to people who are in Afghanistan at the moment. But just last night I was speaking to my Carmyle constituent, Mohammed Asif, who's originally from Afghanistan. He wants to make sure as well that we offer humanitarian protection to those who are already seeking asylum in the city of Glasgow. And the point that was made from the honourable member from Stoke-on-Trent North, yes, the city of Glasgow has done its fair share to welcome refugees, and we stand ready to do a lot more like that. But I've got to say to the honourable gentleman opposite that 30 refugees per parliamentary constituency is a paltry number he should be ashamed of.
But look, at the end of the day, I think it's important that all of us do what we can. And let me commend Glasgow City Council, its MPs, its MSPs, but the people of Glasgow. The people of Glasgow that have done so much to welcome asylum seekers into their city. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the resettlement scheme should emulate and exceed the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, but it must also be enacted and deployed much more quickly than was the case in Syria. Afghan refugees should not and could not wait for up to 5 years for safety. They need safe passage, and they need safe passage now. It should be open to Afghans who supported UK government-funded programmes and who work for the UK and other international organisations. It should have a minimum commitment of welcoming at least 35,000 to 40,000 Afghan refugees in the UK, in line with the population share of refugees welcomed from Syria. 3,000 of these Syrian refugees have now made Scotland their new home. They have contributed to our economy and to our communities. They were Syrians. They are now part of Scotland's story. They are our friends. They are our neighbours. It is only right that we can offer the same warmth and welcome to Afghan refugees facing the same dangerous and desperate situation. Mr. Speaker, this crisis has also shown into sharp focus the disaster of the overseas development cuts rammed through before the summer recess. And you know, when the Prime Minister talks about the increase in spending in Afghanistan, it still doesn't take us to the level of spending that was previously committed. These cuts to overseas aid were immoral and shameful before this humanitarian emergency. It is now a policy that is completely... Do I not listen? Do I not listen? I'm afraid the person that's not listening, and maybe is still on holiday, is the Foreign Secretary, because you haven't taken the spending back to the level when it was. That's the... No, you're not doubling it. And that just shows quite simply, the Foreign Secretary can't...
We don't use you, as you well know, because I don't want to take responsibility, and you wouldn't expect me to.
Certainly don't want to take responsibility for a Foreign Secretary that can't realise the facts of the matter, that you've taken spending to below what it previously was. And if you can't accept that, then I'm afraid the Foreign Secretary can't even count.
Keep using you. You've got to come through me. I'm the chair, not the opposite, not the Foreign Secretary. It's me, Ian Blackford.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I think it is important that the cuts to overseas aid in their entirety are now reversed. Mr. Speaker, I know he's trying to wind me up, but it really...
Don't speak to me.
When the rest of us were doing what we can over the course of the last few days, the Foreign Secretary was lying on a sunbed. So I'm not going to take any lectures from someone like him. People are facing the worst situation imaginable, and you have a Foreign Secretary that's sitting laughing and joking on the government front bench. A Foreign Secretary that should be ashamed of himself, that is demonstrating he has absolutely no dignity whatsoever. And you can carry on saying that it's been doubled, but I'm afraid...
Order! A point of order. Let me just one thing at once. Point of order, Bob Seeley.
Mr. Sturby, so we've had 20 minutes. We now have a private conversation between the front benches. Should we not be debating this, sir?
I think it's for me to decide, and I have mentioned it twice about both sides trying to antagonise each other, which is not a good idea. Whether it's this front bench or that front bench, shouldn't be responding, or a little bit lower down. And I'm sure Mr. Blackford is coming to the end. He did say it wouldn't take too long. Ian Blackford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is an important matter, because the fact is that aid spending in Afghanistan is still below what it was meant to be, and the Foreign Secretary hasn't got the decency to understand that and to accept it. It just shows that he is out of touch with what people want in this House, and out of touch what people want across these islands. And perhaps the Foreign Secretary will get a chance to intervene later on, but continuing to chunter from a sedentary position shows really he has no dignity. He ought to earn some self-respect. And Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the issue of aid, it is very telling to reflect on the chasm between the amount invested in this conflict and the amount invested in development. Since 2001, the UK government has spent around 27.7 billion on military operations in Afghanistan. Over the same period, it has spent approximately 3.8 billion in aid. That amounts to 8 times as much spending on military action over supporting communities or helping rebuild the country. These figures alone should make this House seriously reflect of all those priorities, policies and political decisions that have ultimately resulted in this failure. And the failure rests on the shoulders of the Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary. Billions have been invested to support these failed military decisions, and it is the Afghan people who are left paying the ultimate price. Mr. Speaker, I've concentrated my remarks on the here and now because we understand that the immediate priority must be to do everything that we can to protect lives. But in times, there must also be a chance to review how the UK's involvement in this region went so badly wrong. It is right to put on record today that there must be a future judge-led inquiry into the war in Afghanistan. We owe that to the brave men and women in our military who were sent there, many of them not returning, many of them who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Let me, Mr. Speaker, thank each and every one of them who have given so much to secure peace in Afghanistan. As we exit Afghanistan, it is our forces that have to go back to facilitate our departure, putting themselves on the front line once again. It is little wonder that so many of our service personnel and their families are asking what was our involvement in Afghanistan for. We have let Afghanistan down by the nature of our departure, but we've also let down our military. We should salute each and every one of them. They are right to be angry at the political failure. We owe that inquiry too to the many professionals and volunteers who were led to believe that they were there to support the Afghan people in building their nation. And we owe it to the future that such a massive foreign policy failure is never again repeated. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that Afghanistan did not go from relative stability to chaos overnight. The current situation is an acceleration of an existing state of affairs in which the UK, the US, and the Afghan governments were seemingly unaware. The exit strategy wasn't properly planned, so it appears that the only people who were planning were the Taliban. There remain so many massive questions for the Prime Minister and his government. How did 300,000 men of the Afghan National Defence and Security Forces seemingly vanish overnight? Why was so much trust placed in an Afghan government that equally disintegrated the moment that foreign troops left? Why didn't the UK government push for a United Nations-led exit strategy rather than silently sitting on the sidelines as the US made their decisions? Although history may well cast the final verdict on many of these questions and decisions, we also need the answers and accountability that only a judge-led inquiry can ultimately bring. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I began my remarks by saying that we are witnessing a humanitarian emergency from afar. But the sad reality is that this isn't by any means close to the first tragedy experienced by the Afghan nation. The story of Afghanistan is a country and a people torn apart by tragedy time and time again. Over the years, great powers and vast armies have come and gone. It is the Afghan people who have always been left behind. There is sadly no evacuation and no escape from them from foreign policy failure. I am sure for many Afghan citizens, they simply see a cycle endlessly repeating itself. As an international community, we have collectively wronged these poor people for the very best part of a century. We ask the citizens of Afghanistan to work with us. We watched as girls were able to receive an education, as women were able to excel in so many fields, for a light to be lit, pointing a path to a brighter future for so many to benefit from the freedom of opportunity. That light has been extinguished. The future for so many women and girls is one of a dark, foreboding future. We have let them down. It is now time to do the right thing. For those deserving and in need of our aid and our support, now is the moment to act. Now is the moment for leadership. Well done.
Could I just suggest, I'm starting with the 7-minute limit. Please try and think of others to try and see if you can shorten your speech to try and get as many in today. We start with Sir Peter Bottomley. Sir Peter.
While the best still apply to join our Royal Navy, the Army, the Royal Marines, and the Royal Air Force, we can have hope for the future. We weep for the losses, we acknowledge mistakes, we will remember them. When I, like other MPs, visited our armed forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Falklands, and the former Yugoslavia, I was with ordinary people working together to achieve remarkable results of significance to us and often of life-saving importance to others. Those who are here on the Saturday debate during the Falklands, I think, found a rather different style of debate when people were united in what we ought to try to achieve. As Enoch Powell said, the reason to intervene in the Falklands not was guaranteed to succeed, but it was capable of success. That wouldn't have been the case if we were trying to resist, say, China taking Hong Kong. Our experience in Afghanistan in the 19th century and in the 20 years conflict has now come to an end will make people think whether what was aimed for in Afghanistan after the initial targets were achieved was going to have an end which could be happy or content. I don't think it was an example of trying to resist nationalism, because the forces within Afghanistan are multifarious and have great histories, which I won't go into now. The second debate, which I've read up on and a number of times during my parliamentary service, is the Norway debate, where again there were some speeches of most remarkable intelligence and experience, and others which frankly I think people should have been slightly ashamed of. We have to learn that what this parliament can do, which is not to be government, but to try to question government, support government where appropriate, get them to change at times. And on the question of whether there should be an inquiry, I think it'd be interesting to hear the views of the chairman of the Select Committee for Defence and Select Committee for Foreign Affairs, either today or at some other time, because I think that would be useful. I don't want to spend too much time because I want to make up some of the time that was used by the right honourable gentleman, my friend from the SNP, who, when he said he was concentrating, seemed to have lost his concentration once or twice. And when he said he was being wound up, some of us thought he ought to be wound down. I think the key issue are obvious. What happens now, what is happening now, and then what lessons can be learned. But what is happening now, the reports given by ministers, both in this House and to members of Parliament across the chamber, are important and valuable. Please will those continue. What can happen will be determined in large part by those who are presently in command in Afghanistan. Whether they control Afghanistan is a separate issue. But I think that people may look back and say that the speed of transition in the end might have been better than the prolonged start to a civil war, but that's in the future. We can't judge that, and I'm not going to try to do that. I end by saying this. If we decide we're not going to get involved in world affairs, the world will be worse. If we decide we're going to have the capability to work with others when we can, and occasionally on our own, that's fine. But as Parliament, we ought to be aware we probably made a mistake in backing government over one of the Iraq wars. In my view, we certainly made a mistake in not backing government over Syria. And if you compare the number of people who died in Syria, the refugees around the world, and compare that with Afghanistan, I think we probably should be ashamed of our vote then over Syria. Mr. Speaker, I stop now as an example to others.
We come to Right Honourable Harriet Harman.
and to strongly agree with what was said by the Leader of the Opposition, and to agree too with what was said by the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, who speaks with the experience of having served as Prime Minister, and particularly what she said about the threat of terrorism and the need to fully reinstate our aid budget, the issues for NATO, and the proud legacy of our troops. Mr. Speaker, we've all looked on in horror as the events in Afghanistan have unfolded, and I join everyone who's urging the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary to do everything they can to help UK nationals, including my constituents, who are stranded and in hiding in Kabul and desperately needing to get back home to the UK. And we urgently need to evacuate those who worked with us and feel thereby that they are vulnerable and to whom we have a moral obligation. The government is setting up a refugee resettlement programme, and I would urge the government to make a realistic and generous assessment of the scale of the need and to work with all those local authorities who want to play their part in giving a warm welcome to those who are fleeing. And they need to work, of course, with NATO countries and more widely on an international resettlement programme. But we need to think about those who can't or don't want to leave, particularly women and girls. When the Taliban were last in control, there were literally no girls in school. Now, or at least up until the Taliban took over again, 40% of school children are girls. So there has, over the last 20 years, been a whole generation of girls who've been educated and a whole cohort of young women who've been able to work and want to continue to. When the Taliban were last in control, there were no women in public life, no women to speak up for other women. Women were silenced. Now there are 69 women Afghan MPs. Indeed, 3 years ago, one of them, Eli Ershad, came to this chamber to participate from that front bench, to participate in our Women MPs of the World Conference, and was welcomed by the former Prime Minister to number 10 Downing Street. The President has fled, but Eli is staying in Kabul with her daughters, in solidarity, she says, with her people. What courage! The Afghan army has retreated, but so many Afghan women are standing their ground. All those women politicians and activists are determined not to let the progress of the last 2 decades be crushed. They now face great jeopardy, and I know the whole House and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary will express publicly our solidarity with and admiration for Afghan women MPs who, as parliamentary pioneers, having stepped forward into public life to make a reality of democracy for that half of the population of Afghanistan who are women and girls, now, in the face of such an uncertain future, are determined to protect and defend those rights. And as to what we can do, I would say, don't just listen to the male leaders about what we need to do for women. I would say to the Foreign Secretary, don't just speak to the men. Pick up the phone to those women, Afghan MPs. Ask them what we can do to support women and girls in Afghanistan, and then do it.
Sorry, who have you given way to?
No, she's finished. She's
You've finished, oh. Right, let's move.
Yeah, move on, move on.
Have you finished? Right. Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many veterans, this last week has been one that has seen me struggle through anger and grief and rage, the feeling of abandonment of not just a country, but the sacrifice that my friends made. I've been to funerals from Poole to Dunblane. I've watched good men go into the earth, taking with them a part of me and a part of all of us. And this week has torn open some of those wounds, left them raw, left us all hurting. And I know it's not just soldiers. I know aid workers and diplomats who feel the same. I know journalists who've been the witnesses to our country in its heroic effort to save people from the most horrific fates. I know that we've all been struggling. And if this recall has done one thing, let me tell you now, Mr. Speaker, it's achieved one thing already. I've spoken to the Health Secretary, who's already made a commitment to do more for veterans' mental health. Yeah. This isn't just about us. The mission in Afghanistan wasn't a British mission, it was a NATO mission. It was a recognition that globalization has changed us all. The phone calls that I am still receiving, the text messages that I've been answering as I've been waiting, putting people in touch with our people in Afghanistan, reminds us that we are connected. We are connected still today, and Afghanistan is not a far country about which we know little. It is part of the main. That connection links us also to our European partners, to our European neighbours, and to our international friends. And so it is with great sadness that I now criticise one of them. Because I was never prouder than when I was decorated by the 82nd Airborne after the capture of Musakala. It was a huge privilege to be recognised by such an extraordinary unit in combat. To see their commander-in-chief call into question the courage of men I fought with, to claim that they ran. It's shameful. Those who have never fought for the colours they fly should be careful about criticising those who have. Yeah. Because what we've done in these last few days is we've demonstrated that it's not armies that win wars. Armies can get tactical victories and operational victories that can hold a line. They can just about make room for peace, make room for people like us to talk, to compromise, to listen. It's nations that make war. Nations endure. Nations mobilize and muster. Nations determine and have patience. And here we've demonstrated, sadly, that we, the West, the United Kingdom, does not. Now, this is a harsh lesson for all of us. And if we're not careful, it could be a very, very difficult lesson for our allies. But it doesn't need to be. We can set out a vision, clearly articulated, for reinvigorating our European NATO partners, to make sure that we are not dependent on a single ally, on the decision of a single leader, but that we can work together with Japan and Australia, with France and Germany, with partners large and small, and make sure that we hold the line together. Because we know that patience wins. We know it because we have achieved it. We know it because we have delivered it. The Cold War was won with patience. Cyprus is at peace with patience. South Korea, with more than 10 times the number of troops that America had in Afghanistan, is prosperous through patience. So let's stop talking about forever wars. Let's recognize that forever peace is bought not cheaply, but hard, through determination and the will to endure. And that the tragedy of Afghanistan is that we're swapping that patient achievement for a second fire and a second war. Now we need to turn our attention to those who are in desperate need, supporting the UNHCR, the World Food Programme, and so many other organisations who can do so much for people in the region. Yes, supporting refugees, of course I support refugees, though I'm not going to get into the political auction of numbers. We just need to get people out. So I leave with one image. In the year that I was privileged to be the advisor to the governor of Helmand, we opened girls' schools. And the joy it gave parents to see their little girls going to school was extraordinary, and I didn't understand it until I took my own daughter to school about a year ago. There was a lot of crying when she first went in, but I got over it and it went okay. And I would love to see that continue. But there is a second image I must leave you with, and it is a harder one. But I'm afraid it is one that I think we must all remember.
Only for a minute. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that second image.
I'm very grateful to my friend who was watching the clock more than me. The second image is one that the forever war that has just reignited could lead to. It is the image of a man whose name I never knew, carrying a child who had died hours earlier, carrying this child into our firebase and begging for help. Now, there was nothing we could do. It was over. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is what defeat looks like. It's when you no longer have the choice as to how to help. This doesn't need to be defeat, but at the moment, damn well feels like it.
Ed David. This is a very serious debate. It's a very emotive and a very important speech. We've got to recognise we've got to get through. Ed David.
Mr. Speaker, it's a genuine honour to follow the member for Tunbridge and Malling. And can I thank him on behalf of the whole House and the whole country, not just for his powerful speech today, but for his service, the service of men and women in our armed forces who showed his courage in Afghanistan. And can I agree with him wholeheartedly that if we are going to look forward, we need to work with our international partners in Europe and across the world. We need to forge new relationships and not be over-dependent on one ally, however important and powerful that ally is. And the failure to do that, indeed, the backward steps that this government has taken in that regard in recent years, is one of the reasons why our nation is weaker today than it has been for far too long. And we are deeply proud of our armed forces, our diplomats and our aid workers who've done so much in Afghanistan. So it has been heartbreaking to listen to the families, particularly the 457 British soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice, asking the question in the last few days, what was it all for? And to listen to veterans remembering their comrades, like Captain James Kyle, who made 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, who said on Sunday, after years and years of incredibly hard work from remarkable armed services in the country, I don't know how I could ever look the parents of fallen soldiers in the eye and say that what they did was worth it. So I want to ask the Prime Minister today, will he look our injured veterans and the families of the fallen in the eye and tell them it was worth it, now after his foreign policy catastrophe? For Mr. Speaker, the American decision to withdraw wasn't just a mistake, it was an avoidable mistake. From President Trump's flawed deal with the Taliban to President Biden's decision to proceed and to proceed in such a disastrous way. The human impact on the lives of millions of Afghans, especially women, especially refugees, is the most obvious and alarming consequence. The impact on global politics and on Britain's own national security will be so negative that I fear this mistake will impact the lives of millions around the world for years to come. Mr. Speaker, coalition forces were in Afghanistan for the protection and security of American and British people, just as much as for Afghans. And for well over 7 years, coalition forces have not been doing the vast bulk of the fighting. The Afghan army has. And so, like others, when I heard President Biden blame Afghans for not fighting for their country, I couldn't believe it. He showed no awareness that over 69,000 Afghan forces have been killed. But, Mr. Speaker, I can't hold President Biden to account in this House, but I can hold our own government to account. For our Prime Minister and his cabinet cannot escape their culpability for this disaster, for both the mistaken decision to withdraw and how that withdrawal has turned into such a catastrophe. From the Prime Minister's self-evident lack of influence and clout in Washington, to his negligent inability, yet again, to master his brief and plan properly for the withdrawal. Today's occupant of number 10 has become a national liability. And if the Prime Minister wants to dispel this growing view of him, let him answer the following questions. What role did the British government play in the negotiations with the Taliban that led to President Trump's flawed deal with them? Did the Prime Minister raise any concerns with President Biden about the wisdom of withdrawal from Afghanistan? And what impact, if he did he have in changing anything about President Biden's policy? Mr. Speaker, either Prime Minister has a close relationship with the US, but failed to exploit it, or he has no close relationship and nothing to put in his place. His foreign policy is, frankly, a total disaster. And when it comes to Britain's withdrawal planning, can the Prime Minister explain why he so misjudged the situation in Afghanistan that he told this House back on the 8th of July, and I quote, "I do not think the Taliban are capable of victory by military means." Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister appears to have had no understanding of the security and defence situation in Afghanistan as recently as last month. Despite being warned in this House and elsewhere that the Taliban would move rapidly on Kabul, his failures, along with President Biden's, have led directly to the crisis unfolding before our eyes. Afghans who've risked everything to help our soldiers and aid workers, desperate now for our help to escape. Refugees fleeing in fear of their lives. Women and girls seeing their futures stolen. Mr. Speaker, last night's announcement the government is willing to take only 5,000 refugees in the next year utterly fails to respond to this crisis or to meet our obligations to so many Afghans. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there's a frightening failure to achieve the aim of this whole mission, the aim of keeping British people safe from international terrorists trained in Taliban Afghanistan. Where is the work-through strategy, internationally agreed, to prevent Afghanistan returning to the vector of terrorism it once was? Mr. Speaker, there isn't one. Despite the government having 18 months to prepare, this government has not prepared a counter-terrorism strategy with our allies. And I guess that's why this Prime Minister won't ever be able to look the families of the fallen in the eye.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't often mention my brother, Jonathan, who was killed by Al-Qaeda affiliate in Bali in 2002. It prompted my personal interest in Afghanistan, a distant country I would visit a dozen times over the last 2 decades, to better understand what we were doing to help rebuild this troubled country. And I pay tribute to our armed forces for what they did and what the Defense Secretary and the armed forces are doing today in the evacuation. So it's with utter disbelief seeing us make such an operational and strategic blunder by retreating at this time. A decision that's already triggering a humanitarian disaster, a migrant crisis not seen since the Second World War, and a cultural change in rights to women, and once again, turning Afghanistan into a breeding ground for terrorism. I'm sorry there's no vote here today, because I believe the government would not have the support of the House. The Prime Minister is not in his place, but he says the future of Afghanistan is not written. Well, the future is very much more unpredictable because of our actions. And do not believe for a second that this will be a peaceful transition to the Taliban. It's not universally liked in the country. The Uzbeks and Tajiks warlords are regrouping as we speak. The Northern Alliance will reform once again, and a bloody, terrible civil war will unfold. I will.
Does he have any advice for the government on how it could take action to try and prevent the recurrence of a terrorist threat under Taliban control?
Well, this is my fear, that there will be an attack on the likes of 9/11 to bookend what happened 20 years ago, to show the futility of 20 years. We should never have left, and I'll come on to that in a second. Because after 20 years of effort, this is a humiliating strategic defeat for the West. The Taliban now control more of the territory today than they did before 9/11. Now, I was born in the United States. I'm a proud dual national and passionate about the Transatlantic Security Alliance. And prior to declaring his candidacy, I worked directly with President Biden on veterans' mental health issues. He was the keynote speaker at a veterans reception here in the House of Commons as my guest. So it gives me no joy to criticize the president and say the decision to withdraw, which he inherited but then chose to endorse, was absolutely the wrong call. Yes, 2 decades is a long time. It's been testing chapter for Afghanistan. So the US election promise to return troops was obviously a popular one, but it was a false narrative. Firstly, the notion that we gave the Afghans every opportunity over 20 years to progress, and the country can't be helped forever, so it's time to come home. That glosses over the hurdles, the own goals that we created after the invasion. We denied the Taliban a seat at the table back in 2001. They asked to attend the Bonn talks, but Donald Rumsfeld said no. So they crossed to the Pakistan border to rearm and regroup and retrain. How different the last 2 decades would have been had they been included. And secondly, the Afghan forces themselves. We didn't start training the Afghan forces until 2005, by which time the Taliban were already on the advance. And then finally, we imposed a Western model of governance, completely inappropriate for Afghanistan, where all the power was in Kabul. Completely wrong for a country where loyalty is on a tribal and local level. This is not to dismiss the mass corruption, the cronyism and the elitism that is rife across Afghanistan. But these schoolboy errors in stabilization hampered progress and made our mission harder. There's also the notion that we can't fight a war forever. We've not been fighting for the last 3 years. The US and the UK have not lost a single soldier, but we had a minimalist force there, enough assistance to give the Afghan forces the ability to contain the Taliban and, by extension, legitimacy to the Afghan government. The US have more personnel based in its embassy here than it had troops in Afghanistan before retreating. But both the US and the UK have long-term commitments across the world, which we forget about. Japan, Germany, Korea has already been mentioned. Djibouti, Niger, Jordan, Iraq, ourselves in Cyprus, and Kenya, for example, the Falklands too. It's the endurance that counts. Success is not rated on when you return troops home. This presence offers assurance, it represents commitment, it bolsters regional stability, and it assists with building and strengthening the armed forces. This is exactly what we were doing in Afghanistan. And last year, the Taliban were finally at the negotiation table in Doha. But in a rush to get a result, Trump struck a deal with the Taliban, by the way, without the inclusion of the Afghan government, and committed a timetable for drawdown. And all the Taliban had to do was wait. And the final question about whether the UK can lead or participate in a coalition without the US, well, where is our foreign policy determined? Here or in Washington? Our government should have more confidence in itself. Very briefly.
I'm grateful to the honourable member, and he's making perfectly reasonable and justified criticisms of the way the American government have come to the decision to leave in such haste. But like a number of other honourable and right honourable members, the implication of his speech is somehow we could have had an independent Afghan policy without the Americans. Can you explain how?
Well, firstly, the Americans are not leaving Afghanistan. This is a complete myth. The CIA will remain there, as will special forces and the drone oversight as well. Why? Because they'll be haunted by another terrorist attack. It's the political inclination. It's the leadership that is disappearing because of an American president or two American presidents. And that's where we could have stepped forward and filled the vacuum, but we didn't. We need to have more confidence as a government in ourselves, as we did, in fact, in the last century. Illustrated, I thought this was what was in our DNA. We have the means, the hard power, the connections to lead. What we require is the backbone, the courage, the leadership to step forward. Yet when our moment comes, such as this, we are found wanting. We have some serious questions to ask about our place in the world, what global Britain really means, and what our foreign policy is all about. We must raise our game. Why? Step back. We seem to be in denial about where the world is going. As I've said in this House many times, threats are increasing. Democracy across the globe is under threat. Authoritarianism is on the rise, and yet here we are complicit in allowing another dictatorship to form as we become more isolationist. Tell me, what was the G7 summit all about? The Western reset to tackle growing instability, not least China, Russia, and Iran? Take a look at the map. Where does Afghanistan sit? Right between all three. Strategically, a useful country to stay close to. Now we've abandoned it, and the Afghan people as well. Shame on us. I hope the government thinks long and hard about our place in the fast-changing world. Bigger challenges, bigger threats loom over the horizon. We are currently woefully unprepared and uncommitted. We, the UK and the West, have so many lessons to be learned. I repeat my call for an independent inquiry. We must learn these lessons quickly. The West is today a little more weaker and the world a little more dangerous because we gave up on Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I pay my respects to all those military personnel who've lost their lives, all those who are still under the trauma of mental health, all those who are still suffering from lifelong injuries that are sustained, and all those diplomats, all those journalists, and 69,000 Afghani soldiers who have lost their lives during the last 20 years. We went into 2001 into Afghanistan to say to the people, we're going to get rid of this military, this medieval regime, and we're going to bring you up to speed on what we believe your living standards, your education, and your living systems and styles should be. We promised all those women, that they could move forward. They could be judges. They could be politicians. They could be teachers. They could learn. They could do what we can do. They could do everything that they were to do. And that was the right thing to do, because they should be able to do that. But now, all those women, all those judges who wanted to put the system right in Afghanistan, will they still be able to do that? The Taliban is saying that we will treat everybody fairly, but under jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence. Does anybody understand what Islamic jurisprudence is? It's applied by individuals, Mr. Speaker. It's applied by those people that are in charge at that place. It is applied by those people who sit in judgment. Their jurisprudence can be different from anybody else in that area. So when we say, okay, well, they've given us these guarantees, we need to look at what those guarantees will mean to those women and how they're going to be treated. Over the last 12 years, we've taken no real action in Afghanistan. The Obama government dithered as to what they wanted to do. The Trump government didn't know what it was doing and tried to do backdoor deals and did backdoor deals with the Taliban. The Biden government has just come in and without looking at what's going on the ground, has decided to take a unilateral decision, throwing us and everybody else to the fire, and decided to withdraw in a manner that no military person of any rank would perceive fit in the arena that those people are serving in. What we did wrong during that period, and as the Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead and the Right Honourable Member for Bournemouth East said, we didn't understand the government. We didn't understand how they worked. Afghanistan has never been part of Kabul as an only entity. Of those people who ran the government that we placed in, totally corrupt, hardly any mandate, and were there for themselves. As we've seen, as the current president has run away, leaving all those brave women to stay and believe in what they believe in. That is the government that we supported. Had we had looked at the regional possibilities, had we looked at the regional government and what was going on, the regional warlords, the regions, what they were playing at, we would have understood what the force of the Taliban was. We'd have understood what their training was. We'd have understood how many people that had been gathering in their ranks. We didn't do that. And that is why we're suffering these consequences. President Biden has decided to pull out because he doesn't believe there now is a direct threat to the US. I don't know where he's got that intelligence from, but let's see how that goes. But what he needs to understand is this is not just about the terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan. This is also about the economic war in the region that is going on. By vacating Afghanistan, by not speaking to its neighbor Pakistan, he will now provide a clear corridor for China and Russia to come through. And that is the one thing that is not about a 20-year-long war. That is about the current situation, the economy, and the position of that geographic area. And I hope that he would understood that, but unfortunately, I don't think he's managed to understand that. I just very quickly, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of refugees. First of all, what we need to do is to ensure that those refugees currently fleeing into Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of people are crossing that border. The Prime Minister didn't once mention what relationship he has, what work he's doing, what support he's going to give to that region, to Pakistan, to speak to them about what to do. Because if we don't support those refugees, if we don't understand what's going on, then what will happen is that those people will be left to the all those people traffickers who are out there exploiting them, children losing their lives in the seas, and God knows where else, because we need to coordinate this. We know enough about this, and we need to be able to move forward and not have the mistakes that we already made. We need to work this properly, look to the region, support the people at the source, and resolve these issues, and not leave it to the very end. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for calling me in this debate. And I just want to make three really broad points about what has gone on over the last week. I want to talk about responsibility. I want to talk about this place's responsibility towards those who serve. I want to talk about our Afghan friends and our Afghan partners. And I also want to speak to and for, if I can, a number of veterans of that conflict who I've spoken to over the last week. When it comes to responsibility, can I just urge ministers to be very careful around talking exclusively about the Americans? We are very clear, and it is well understood, that they are the framework nation, or were the framework nation in Afghanistan. But people who join the military from council estates in Plymouth, Newcastle, Stoke, Birmingham, they do not serve the American flag. They serve the British flag. Absolutely. They're proud to do so. They do it at the behest of ministers in this place. And it dishonors their service to simply say the Americans have left, we are leaving. We do not spend £40 billion a year on a tier one military to be unable to go out the door without the Americans. And the taxpayer does not expect that. And I would urge ministers to take responsibility for the decisions they make, particularly when talking with the families. I want to talk about our Afghan friends and partners. And I'm pleased with the announcement today around refugees. It's a good start. Okay, people can talk numbers, they can say we want more, we want less. Okay, the reality is it's basic maths, right? We are not going to get everyone out of Afghanistan who we promised to. Okay, so we can say we want more, we can say we want less. But the truth is as well, we have to be honest in this place. Okay, and campaigners have for many, many years campaigned against this relocation scheme, the previous intimidation scheme, and said it wasn't good enough. Okay, and ministers in this house have made decisions that has made it harder for them to come. So whilst I welcome this change today and our onward progression, let's not kid ourselves about what has happened in the past and treat those who are campaigning for these people who have no self-interest of their own with perhaps a little bit more respect than they currently get at the moment. But finally, I do want to speak to veterans and for veterans if I can. And it's clear to me in the last few days, and Help for Heroes put out something yesterday. Okay, these are new feelings. These are new feelings that we are not trained to deal with. We're not trained to lose, and we're not trained for ministers to, in a way, choose to be defeated by the Taliban. Was it all for nothing? Of course it wasn't for nothing, okay? And we have to get away from this narrative. You know, for a period of time, whether we like it or not, for a period of time, okay, Afghans, the average age in Afghanistan, 18 years old, they will have experienced a freedom and privileges that we enjoy here, and no one will ever take that away from them. And that's incredibly important. And what are we here to do if it's not to be good, honourable people and fight for the oppressed, to keep our families safe and live to a higher calling? And you did this over many years in some of the hardest conditions against as dark an enemy as this nation has ever faced. We often looked to our forefathers for inspiration. You emulated them. You did them proud, not in scale, but in the same amphitheatre. And you can be forever proud of what you did when the nation called. You played your role. You cannot control what is happening now. Remember that. What folk like me saw you do, the courage, the sacrifice, the humanity, will never die. And it has defined us as human beings. You did that. Nobody will ever take that away. I will never forget you. And every day the sun comes up, I will make sure this place and this country never forgets you and your sacrifice on the altar of this nation's continuing freedom. The government must now step up and support this group of bereaved families and veterans. We are going to see a bow wave of mental health challenges. We're not trained to cope with the feelings we have now. I've done everything I possibly could to support all the brilliant staff in the MOD, the Office of Veterans Affairs, the NHS, who work tirelessly supporting veterans up and down this country. But I must say to the House with a heavy heart, the Prime Minister has consistently failed to honour what he said he would do when he was trying to become Prime Minister. The Prime Minister must not wriggle out of his commitments on this issue. The Office of Veterans Affairs is nothing like it was designed to be, and he knows that. The paltry £5 million funding slashed after less than a year. The lack of staff, not even an office to work from. Even today, the brilliant staff at the Office of Veterans Affairs simply cannot cope with the scale of the demand. And whilst his predecessors may get away with a certain degree of ignorance in this space, I'm afraid, Prime Minister, you have no excuse on this issue. It is a political choice. The ambivalence needs to end. He needs to step up and listen to the charities, listen to veterans, not those you choose to employ around you, who do not believe veterans' issues are worth the political capital required. The nation cares. We will make this government care. The scale of this challenge in dealing with this Afghan generation is only just beginning. I'd like to pay tribute to everybody who has spoken up in this debate, but particularly those who don't have a vested interest in Afghanistan and can see the inherent injustice of what is happening now. And thank you, Mr. Speaker, for recalling this House today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable member for Plymouth Moorview, as it was the honourable members for Bournemouth East and Plymouth and Tonbridge and Malling, all who spoke with great eloquence. Like many honourable members, I'm sure, I'm racked with a profound sadness at the catastrophe that we've seen unfolding in Afghanistan. Above all, it is an unspeakable tragedy for the people of that country, who after generations of conflict now live under a terrible cloud of fear and repression. Who could fail to be moved by the agonizing scenes from Kabul airport just this week? How desperate must you have to be to want to cling onto the side of a moving aircraft? These past 20 years have been a struggle for peace. We tried to break the cycle of war, to give hope to women and girls. We tried to give the Afghans a different life, one of hope and one of opportunity. But the catastrophic failure of international political leadership and the brutality of the Taliban has snatched all of that away from them. The new administration in Kabul should know that they will be judged not by their words, but by their actions. The world is watching. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to reflect on the service and the sacrifice of our brave servicemen and women who throughout showed outstanding professionalism and courage. But as the honourable member from Plymouth Moorview said just a moment ago, recent developments have hit them hard. They're grappling with the question about whether all of the effort, the sacrifice, was really worth it. They're again grieving for fallen comrades who didn't come home. But whatever the outcome is in Afghanistan, those men and women and their families should be proud of their service, and we must be proud of them. Now, many of us who served in Afghanistan have a deep bond of affection for the Afghan people. And I had the honour of serving alongside them in Helmand. We trained together, fought together, and in some cases, we died together. They were our brothers in arms. But I shudder to think where those men are now. Many will be dead. Others, I know, now consider themselves to be dead men walking. Where were we in their hour of need? We were nowhere. And that is shameful. And it will have a very long-lasting impact on Britain's reputation right around the world. I will give way to
my honourable friend, fellow litigator, is absolutely right in his description of the Afghan armed forces. Will he add to his comments now that many of them are more heroic and better soldiers than they give them credit for around the world?
Be grateful to the right honourable gentleman, as I always am. I completely agree with the point he made. It was particularly distasteful and dishonouring of President Biden to make reference to the lack of courage and commitment by those Afghan soldiers who've served with such bravery and distinction. I think we have to be pragmatic, and I think at this difficult point, we have to think about what our next move is going to be. And we should understand that the character of our country is defined, for better or for worse, by moments like this. We should also understand that we are facing a moral and humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions. And the response from the international community and from the British government needs to meet the magnitude of the moment. So, step up the statecraft, engage with international allies and alliances, and with regional partners. And although it is a particularly bitter pill to have to swallow, we must engage diplomatically with the new regime in Kabul. It is in our cold-headed national interest to do so, because right now our armed forces are deployed on an operation to recover UK nationals and other entitled personnel. It's in their interests that we engage to try and ensure the safe passage of those wanting to leave. But we also know that many, many more will want to get out. And with our allies, we need to work to establish safe routes to get them to safety. We must show compassion and genuine generosity to refugees whilst accelerating and expanding the Arab scheme to support those who supported us. We also need to defend the hard-won progress over the past 20 years or so. Girls in school, women in parliament and in the judiciary. We must ensure that Afghanistan does not slide back to where it was pre-9/11. And then, when the dust settles, we need to look at what went wrong and learn the lessons of this failure. Why, despite all of the effort, we couldn't build an Afghan state free from corruption with the legitimacy and competence to balance the competing forces within that country, and what that now means for our foreign and defence policy in this country. Regardless of all of that, we must remain engaged. We must show leadership. We must use whatever influence we have to try and make things better. That's in our own national interest. It's in line with our values, and it's the right thing to do. We owe that to the people of Afghanistan, and we owe that to ourselves.
Alicia Cairns.
It has been said that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades pass, and what we are seeing in Afghanistan this week is decades and will shape the rest of my lifetime and many of ours in this room. This is a wholly preventable tragedy, Mr. Speaker, and I and many colleagues around me are so very, very angry. Our government called for NATO allies to help us build a new coalition in Afghanistan to prevent the Taliban recapturing, and we were let down. Only Turkey was willing to stand alongside us because they know what a failed state looks like. They have seen the refugees they support. They have seen the terrorists on their doorstep. They have seen the conflict and the suffering. And it is bitterly disappointing. And there is much we must learn from this. Because the UK could not have saved all these lives on our own. And multilateral collective responsibility should mean something. And too often today, I believe that it doesn't. Now, I've spent the last few days listening to our veterans, many of whom live in Rutland and Melton. And I would like to say to them now, and many of us in this place will never truly understand the scars you carry, and we will never understand all you encountered. But all of you have left me with one request: get the people out. And that is what I have been fighting for the last few days, along with so many of my colleagues in this place. The veterans, the interpreters who supported families and identified IEDs, the female journalists fighting for their lives who've already had mines blow up their stations, and those who negotiated for their fellow Afghans against the Taliban. And I must thank the Defence Secretary, because he has been constant in his support every hour over the weekend, helping me to get these people out, so I thank him for his time. This must be our priority, getting people out, and I welcome the Prime Minister's G7-led multilateral refugee programme. We have to get non-combatant evacuations proceeding at pace, but we are only operating with the consent of the Taliban, most certainly at the airport, and that can be withdrawn at any time. So my primary concern is those safe routes to the airport. The air bridge must be operational at all times, and we must negotiate departures from not just Kabul. Land convoys must be considered humanitarian corridors. Once we get these people out, we must ensure that refugee families are welcome to our country so they can build the lives they never asked for. The kindness of the British people is great, and Melton Borough Council and Harbour District Council have both stepped up already to the plate and said they would like to take as many refugees as they can. The MOD is working with me to identify housing stock from the MOD in Rutland and across the constituency of Rutland and Melton. But I call for the government to consider creating an initiative that allows British nationals to open their homes, their spare bedrooms, their second homes to these Afghans, similar to the private sponsorship route that already exists, because the British people want to step up and help. But beyond the immediate life-saving operations, there is much we must talk about. First, the British government and the international community must recognise that the withdrawal is emblematic of a changing American posture. The comments we have seen over the last few days have rattled me to my core. And yes, you are not meant to speak ill of your friends and allies, but in this case, we have no alternative but to call out the comments against our Afghan allies. The views of European allies like the UK may no longer hold the same sway in Washington as they have under this presidency. And that means we must take greater responsibility for our defence around the world. And global Britain means we must act autonomously but through multilaterals on the world stage with other partners. And we must convince our NATO allies that we can all stand together without the Americans. Yes, they bring the kit. Yes, they bring the money. Yes, they bring the numbers. But this is something we can and must do. We must shift from this model of being overly reliant on the US. Thirdly, we must fix our broken international system because it is not saving lives. The UN has failed to enable a political solution. There is no meaningful method or tactics to prevent the worst excesses of the Taliban, and the system is being undermined by hostile money flooding fragile states. And there are hostile states sitting on the human rights and women's councils of all of those organisations of the multilateral world. And it is our duty as the UK to fix the international system because we can do it. I have sat at the negotiating tables. It is the UK that brings countries together behind the scenes. It is the UK that provides the bureaucracy and systems that allow coalitions to be effective. We must recognise our unique expertise and step up. We must also look hard at our strategic goals in South Asia because China is most certainly doing that. Their goals are securing influence against Pakistan, stripping minerals, and creating an alternative, superior diplomatic track. Their plunder diplomacy is well underway, and they're using the situation to threaten Taiwan already, saying, look what the Americans will do. They will leave you. By recognizing the Taliban, China has taken the first step towards creating an alternative international mechanism, where the gravitational shift is towards them, and we must stand strong against this. I also urge caution about our posture towards the Taliban, because I must confess that I see it as simply platitudes being laid before the international community, little more than a tactic to allow the Taliban to consolidate their control, to avoid sanctions, keep the aid money rolling in, root out all those on their hit list, and avoid UN Security Council measures. Perhaps I'm wrong, but Pashtun Wali tells us that Taliban intent includes justice or revenge as one of the core tenets of their society and way of life. We must also adequately monitor Al-Qaeda. The human cost of this withdrawal is monumental, but the strategic consequences risk being so much greater if we do not learn the lessons of the last few decades. We must properly focus on atrocity prevention. The new conflict centre, which I fought for, must lead our way in deciding how we become more strategic. We cannot be everywhere in this world, and we cannot rescue every mission, but we can work on two core principles. The first is to protect our nation, protect our people, and protect our prosperity. And we must be single-minded in our focus on this and incredibly strategic. And the second must be to live up to our promises so we can look those in the eye to whom we've made promises, to whom our veterans made promises, and stand squarely behind them. I think we can't go wrong if this guides us in our foreign policy. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to thank our armed forces and our border staff and our Foreign Office staff and Sir Laurie Bristow for the heroic work they are doing to get people out. I've worked in the crisis centre. I know the hours they're working. We are so grateful to all they are doing, putting their lives at risk for the duty and responsibilities of this House. Madam Deputy Speaker, we speak today in a changed world, and I have no doubt that we will open our hearts to the people of Afghanistan, and together this House must mourn those who are left behind and those who will not make it already. But our singular purpose has to be atrocity prevention in the future, recognising where the threats to this country lie, making sure we are single-minded in our focus of challenging those and protecting our people, and making sure that the world that has become darker this week and more uncertain is one where at least we know the light which we will follow ourselves. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Diane Abbott. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We in this House have all seen, and our constituents have all seen, the chaos and the speed of the Taliban takeover. And one of the questions we have to address today and in days to come is how did it happen and what lessons are to be learned? But the points I wanted to make this afternoon were about the people that, as a British people, we cannot let down. First of all, we cannot let down the British veterans who over 20 years fought in Afghanistan, particularly in Helmand, one of the most dangerous provinces to fight in, I understand. And I can do no better than quote Jack Cummings, who's been quoted in recent days. He's a former British soldier who lost both legs. On August the 14th, 2010, searching for improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan. And he said a few simple sentences, but they're worth repeating. He said, "Was it worth it?" And he replied to his own question, "Probably not." He asked, "Did I lose my legs for nothing?" And he replied to his own question, "Looks like it." And then finally he said, "Did my mates die in vain?" And he replied to his own question, "Yep." We as a House of Commons, we as a Parliament should not, cannot let down Jack Cummings and those 457 British soldiers that died in Afghanistan. So this debate, which we're having this afternoon, we are going to have to continue as a Parliament to understand the lessons to be learned from what is happening to Afghanistan at the present time. The other people we can't let down are the people of Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan. We know how many of them have died, and we know that even as we speak today, there are women and girls in their homes or hiding or running away who are frightened for their future, even frightened for their prospects, frightened for their lives under this Taliban regime. And with everything we do, with the political solution, with the debate, with discussion, with the talk with NATO allies, we have to have the future for these Afghanistan women and girls at the center of what we are talking about and what we are trying to do. Because in this past 20 years, it's not just that 457 British veterans died, so that's very tragic, and that's why I mentioned it. But we gave these women and girls hope. We gave these women and girls hope of a better future. We gave these women and girls hope of the prospects that women and girls all over the world, including here in Britain, have. And we cannot just sit back and have them see that hope snatched away. So we cannot let down the people of Afghanistan, and we cannot let down those women and girls. And finally, we cannot let down the refugees that we know will be pouring out of Afghanistan. Now, the debate on refugees in the British Parliament is sometimes a little complex, sometimes a little difficult. Sometimes people have more to say about the burden of refugees than our moral responsibility to refugees. But as someone who was in this House 20 years ago, when we voted on an adjournment for this military intervention, we have an extraordinary moral responsibility to these refugees. We have a responsibility to towns and cities all over this country, in Scotland, who may well need more support from government, more finance from government, but we cannot let down those refugees. Our political and moral responsibility is too great. So it's been tragic to see the chaos of the Taliban takeover. But if we do the right thing by our veterans, the right thing by the Afghan people, and the right thing by refugees, we can at least, as a country, know that we have followed on from the initiative we took 20 years ago to intervene in that region in order to bear down on terrorism and disorder. I didn't vote for the intervention in Afghanistan 20 years ago. I'm afraid it was foreseeable that it would end like this. But it is not inevitable that we as a country, that this as a parliament, will not do the right thing. So I urge colleagues on both sides of the House to address the important issue being raised today so we can go forward in pride and in confidence of our own understanding of our moral responsibility. Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his speech of self-justification after the collapse of Kabul, President Biden reduced a complex military issue to only two stark alternatives. It was a gross oversimplification for him to pose a devil's dilemma between either a massive troop surge on a never-ending basis or a ruthless, chaotic, and dishonorable departure. Ruthless because people who trusted NATO will pay a terrible price. Chaotic because of a lack of foresight to plan an orderly and properly protected departure. Dishonorable because even if our open-ended nation-building micromanagement strategy was wrong, as I think it was, in 20 years we created expectations and obligations which those who relied on us had a right to expect us to fulfill, as the Right Honourable Lady has just said for Hackney North. It has been pointed out correctly that for 20 years, NATO operations in Afghanistan succeeded in preventing further al-Qaeda attacks on the West being launched under Taliban protection. That was indeed the key outcome. But unless we choose a better future strategy, the threat of its reversal is all too real. Not only may sanctuary again be offered on Afghan soil to lethal international terrorists, but other Islamist states may also decide to follow suit. So how should we have handled a country like Afghanistan when it served as a base and a launch pad for al-Qaeda? And how should we deal with such situations in the future? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are my personal views on a defence issue unrelated to the work of the ISC on intelligence and security. But for the past 10 years, much often to the dismay of my parliamentary colleagues, both inside this chamber and outside, I've argued that a form of containment rather than counterinsurgency is the only practical answer to international terrorist movements sheltered and sponsored by rogue regimes like the Taliban. Containment, as older colleagues will remember, was the policy which held the Soviet Union in check throughout the Cold War until its empire imploded and its ideology was discredited. Islamist extremism has a subversive reach similar to that of revolutionary communism, and our task is to keep them at bay until they collapse completely or evolve into tolerant or at least tolerable alternative doctrines. In Afghanistan, the task of overthrowing the Taliban and driving al-Qaeda into exile was quickly accomplished in 2001. And at that point, NATO arrived at a fork in the road. The option, as we know, which was selected, was an open-ended commitment to impose a Western version of democracy and protect it indefinitely in a country which had a strong sense of its own political and social culture and which was known to be politically allergic to foreign intervention. Yet there was another option available to Western strategists in response to the 9/11 attacks. Having achieved our immediate objectives of putting al-Qaeda to flight and punishing the Taliban, we should have announced that we were completely removing our forces, but would promptly return by land and air to repeat the process if international terrorist groups were again detected in Afghanistan. When the Taliban regain full territorial control, they will lose their shield of invisibility. If they then choose to pose or facilitate a renewed threat, a terrorist threat to Western security, they should expect both their leadership and their military capability to be hit hard by our mobile land and air forces. That cycle would be repeated until the threat was removed, but we should not and would not allow our forces to be sucked in again. And I will.
Most grateful to my right honourable friend giving way. He makes some very important points. And has the game changed slightly, though, from the position he lays, that with the immediate recognition by China and Russia of the Taliban government, being permanent members of the Security Council may make it very difficult to get any UN-led action in the way that my right honourable friend describes?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, but of course, this was a NATO intervention, and it is to NATO that we have to look when serious threats to international security, particularly affecting Western interests, are concerned. But the point about this is its flexibility, because Al-Qaeda itself is very flexible. And an active containment policy of this sort can track and match the flexibility of the terrorists. Such a policy depends upon the maintenance of integrated and highly mobile land forces pre-positioned in regional strategic base and bridgehead areas, SBBAs. I will, okay.
Grateful. In his capacity as chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee of this House, given what he's just said, it does require for that strategy to be successful, excellent intelligence and a good analysis of it so ministers can make sound decisions. In this case, I fear that hasn't been the case. Does his committee have any plans to investigate the intelligence failures that have taken place in this case so that we can deliver the strategy he's so excellently setting out?
Well, I'm glad my right honourable friend approves of the strategy, but I said earlier, this is a speech by me on defence in my capacity, if anything, as a former chairman of the Defence Committee. I'm not in a position at this stage to say anything publicly about what the ISC might or might not agree to do, but obviously his suggestion is pertinent. So the point about strategic base and bridgehead areas is that they contain integrated forces which are ready to strike, then to withdraw, then to strike again whenever and wherever needed. In Afghanistan, or in any other susceptible state which becomes what our Defence Secretary and now our Prime Minister have rightly described as breeding grounds for Al-Qaeda or similar international terrorist groups, proportionate military initiatives would be taken and interventions made without undue logistical complexity and without getting sucked in to full-scale counterinsurgency campaigning in the host countries whilst the terrorists redirect their efforts to neighbouring countries, leaving us mired in the original countries from which they operate. Active containment is the hard-headed solution to an otherwise intractable dilemma, whether to allow terrorists to attack us with impunity or whether to shoulder the unending burden of indefinitely occupying every reckless rogue state which shelters and supports them. So it's okay for people to say, well, this is over, there's no way, we're not going back into Afghanistan. I don't want to be here in years or months to come when there has been another spectacular Al-Qaeda type of attack on a Western country and people are looking around once again for a strategy if we are in a situation, as it seems that we are, when the President of the United States can only see total withdrawal on one side or endless commitment on the other. There is a flexible middle way, and it is an adaptation of the way in which we successfully saw off our Cold War confrontation. It worked then in a very different context. It would work now in this context too.
There are obviously a great many colleagues who are trying to catch my eye. So after the next contribution, I will have to reduce the time limit to 5 minutes. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And today, as we look on at the situation in Afghanistan, we think first and foremost of the plight of the people of that beleaguered country. And I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is my view that today is not a day for political point scoring. It is a day for this House to reflect on what we need to do as a Parliament and a government to respond to this crisis. And whilst people have made valid points in this debate, and I respect that, I think that the people in Afghanistan, the people who are in desperation at Kabul airport, don't want to hear our point scoring. They want to know what we're going to do to help them. And that is what we must turn our mind to. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to pay tribute today as have other right honourable members, to our brave servicemen and women and others who have served our countries, and to those in particular who have sacrificed their lives in Afghanistan. And I want to recall in particular the 9 service personnel from Northern Ireland who gave their lives in Afghanistan during operations there. And I am going to name those individuals because I think it is worthy that we remember who these people are and their families at this time. Channing Day, a young woman killed in action from Cumber in County Down. David Dalzell, 20 years old, from Bangor in County Down. Aaron McCormick, 22 years old, from McCosquin in County Londonderry. Stephen McKee, 27 years old, from Banbridge in County Down. Nigel Moffat, 29 years old, from Belfast. David Patton, 38, from Akadui in County Antrim. Neil Turkington, 26, from Craigavon in County Armagh. And in my own constituency, Stephen Walker from Lisburn, 42 years old, and Captain Mark Hale, 42 years old, from Dramara in County Down. Almost all of the counties in Northern Ireland, indeed probably all of them, represented by that roll call. We're very proud of our armed forces and the fact that during the campaign in Afghanistan, more reserve forces from Northern Ireland were deployed from our region than from any other part of the United Kingdom. The willingness of our men and women to give up their time to volunteer to serve in our armed forces needs also to be recognised. And we support them. And I certainly don't adhere to the view that their sacrifice was in vain. And we applaud what they have done, even though now we look upon political failure in Afghanistan. We need to learn the lessons from that, Madam Deputy Speaker. We need to understand what has gone wrong. But first and foremost, we must look to the humanitarian assistance that is now urgently required, and especially to those men and women who supported our armed forces in Afghanistan. And I've, like many in this House, have had veterans contact me, knowing interpreters, civilian staff who worked in Camp Bastion, in other military bases occupied by the British Armed Forces, desperate to know what we're going to do to help those men and women who now face, well, goodness knows what plight they may suffer at the hands of the Taliban. We need to step up now. As they stepped up for us during this war in Afghanistan, we now must step up for them and offer them sanctuary, these courageous people and their families. We need also to consider, Madam Deputy Speaker, the plight of religious minorities, to which my honourable friend, the member for Northampton, referred earlier, including Christians who now face massive persecution in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is ranked only second to North Korea in terms of its levels of religious persecution against Christians and others. And we must not lose sight of that in the midst of all of this. And then, of course, there is the threat of international terrorism, the reason why we entered Afghanistan in the first place. And the Prime Minister is right. We must now take all reasonable steps to ensure that Afghanistan once again does not become a location for the training of extremist terrorists, a base from which to launch attacks on the Western world. We must ensure that our intelligence capacity is enhanced. And I look on, Madam Deputy Speaker, with some degree of trepidation when I consider some of the intelligence failures we've witnessed in recent times. We must do more to resource our intelligence services to ensure that we know and understand what is happening in Afghanistan, and in particular in relation to the Taliban and their links to extremist Islam and the potential for international terrorism, to now have a safe haven from which to operate. And my final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is on overseas aid. I'm not going to point score here, but I will simply make the point that we cannot seriously at this time contemplate cutting our international aid budget when people are in absolute desperation. It is a mark of this country that it is strong in its humanity, in its desire to help others. And we must do that now. And stepping up to the mark doesn't just mean in military terms. It doesn't just mean in defense terms. It doesn't just mean in political terms. It means with our heart as well, and that we reach out to those who are in need. We ensure they have the support and the resources they require. Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, there will be time to look at what went wrong here. There will be a time, perhaps, for political recrimination. But now is the time for this country to stand tall. It is the time for this country to step up and do what is necessary to help the people in Afghanistan, especially those who helped us during the war.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, can I just say that the visions on the television sets the other day were redolent very much of 1975, no matter what Secretary of State Blinken said. The parallels with the departure from Saigon of the Americans was shocking, but also very true. The reality for us is that the point I want to make is that the way we withdraw matters almost as much as the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. I want to come back to that in a second. The chaotic, ghastly departure, the way that people were falling off the aircraft in their determination to get away and the helicopter shipping people out, says terrible things about the values that we hold and those who we wish to protect. So this is a shame on all of us, not just America, but also the whole of NATO and here for us in this House. The fact is that we know that US support for the military in Afghanistan had evaporated, and there was pressures to leave. But the US was a better way, because the US non-partisan Afghan study group came forward and said that actually over the last 18 months, the US had suffered no casualties at all. They'd withdrawn directly from the front line, and the UK the same. But we were giving support, help, and aid to those who were in the front line, the 70,000 that died who were members of the Afghan forces, whom we should be incredibly proud of today.
On that point,
indeed.
very briefly, the Prime Minister reminded the House the Afghans lost 70,000 men who we helped to train and fought alongside. Even though they were not paid, some of them for many months, because of endemic corruption in Kabul. Does my right honourable friend agree, therefore, to imply, as some have, that they basically ran away, when for 10 years and more they've done precisely the opposite, is basically shameful?
It is no question, it is an infamous statement to make. These men and women had lost their lives in trying to uphold what we had brought to Afghanistan, and we should be proud of them. And I do say to the American president, even though the government is perhaps reluctant to say this, and even the opposition leadership, I say to the American president, you have no right to use excuses and base them on people who have lost their lives and done so bravely. The withdrawal of the air support was critical at that moment. The moment that went, the Taliban got a green light and they knew they were going to go in, and these Afghan forces could not be supported. That was a critical decision. It was done in a hurry, and it was wrong. And the reality is, as I was saying earlier on, the Afghan study group said that there was no need for this precipitative departure in America. They could have kept a number of forces there at a much lower cost, supporting those in the front line, and we could have supported them doing this. And I asked my right honourable friend who gets up later on, did we at any stage demand that the US government review their decision Did we say to them this was wrong? Did we say we must find a way to support what we have started in Afghanistan? And I say really the point that I want to make here is because it's not just, and I'm proud about what our troops achieved, and I know they will feel deserted at this point. And I didn't serve there, but I've served in Northern Ireland. I know what the feeling is. But I say those who died today rise in glory because they gave something to the Afghans, which is what we call hope. But we must find a way that it is not dashed. And the truth is, the big sad truth is that, sorry, I give way.
Grateful. On that point of hope, that 45-year-old woman in Kabul on Sunday who spent 20 years being oppressed and having access to education reduced, has spent 20 years with good fortune raising a family with women and girls, and is now facing that, all of that being taken away. Would he agree with me that we need to offer her hope as well?
We do. The problem is that we've pulled out, and the Americans have pulled out. And that is the problem. We have to find a way now to support them. That's absolutely the case. And those who need to come here must come here. The doors must be open. We must do what we have to do. But the problem I have now is that the West, upholding democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, is in retreat. We have now opened the door to the Chinese and the Russians, who, by the way, kept their embassies open throughout the whole of this, fully staffed, with permission from the Taliban. You see the Chinese Minister for Foreign Affairs now meeting the Taliban. They have now recognized the Taliban. So what are we dealing with here? Taiwan. Let me just read what the mouthpiece of the Chinese government said, the Global Times. They said yesterday, from what has happened in Afghanistan, those in Taiwan should perceive that once a war breaks out in the Straits, the island's defense will collapse in hours and the US military won't come to help. That would have gone out under President Xi's directive. They know what they're dealing with. Their belief now is we will not stand up for freedom. We will not stand up for democracy. And we have encouraged those, the totalitarian states and those terrible oppressive states that we know of, we have encouraged them to believe that we are in full retreat. After Saigon, America left the global stage for a decade, and there was terrible consequences, Iran and everywhere else. We cannot allow that to happen again. I criticized America for this, but I know also they are our greatest and best allies and best hope of freedom. We need to bring them back. That is the job of the British government, is now to bring the Americans back to realize their commitment. Let me just quote what John Kennedy said all those years ago. He said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." That is what should enshrine our purpose. The concept of democracy and human rights is a delicate flower. It is not the natural state of being unless you defend it. And we must defend it wherever it is. Yes, there are costs. There is a better way in Afghanistan. But what we have done in this chaotic rush, despicable retreat from Kabul, is to hearten and to embolden those who would bring it down. I remind the House that President Reagan, when pressed about this, and I hope the US listens to this particular one, he said, "Freedom is never more than a generation away from extinction. It must be fought for." We in this House take these liberties for granted. We must speak out. America must come back, and we must send a signal immediately that we are not going to give way, that the totalitarian states of China and Russia cannot win in the end, that Islamic extremism cannot be found a bolt hole. Yes, we want to say Taliban must step up, but what will we do about it? Now we have to put means behind words. This House must make that happen.